Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The sun hung low in the sky as Ryan tightened the straps on his backpack, casting a golden light over the winding trail ahead. He glanced back at his friends, both of whom were already lost in their own thoughts. Eve was adjusting her hiking boots, the experienced outdoorswoman always meticulous about her gear. Jack, on the other hand, was laughing at something on his phone, his eyes glued to the screen, oblivious to the quiet beauty of the forest surrounding them. You know, I've heard a lot about this place, Ryan said, his voice breaking the silence. He turned to Jack, who looked up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. There are stories, legends, about the Hollow Ones. Jack snorted. Hollow Ones? Seriously? Sounds like something out of a bad horror movie. He shoved his phone into his pocket and adjusted his own backpack with a sigh. Come on, Ryan. This is real life. Nothing spooky's going to happen. Eve shot Jack a disapproving look, but didn't say anything. She had been quiet ever since they'd left the small town behind, and Ryan knew she was worried. Not about the legends, but about something else, the forest itself. There was an ancient, unsettling quality to the trees that made even her steady nerves twitch. They're not just stories, Ryan persisted, eyes alight with excitement. Local legends. People say there's a reason no one comes out here. People who get too deep into the woods while they never come back. Right. Jack's voice was dripping with sarcasm, but Eve, ever the pragmatist, interrupted before Ryan could continue. Enough, she said, her voice firm. We've been talking about this hike for months. Let's enjoy it, okay? The Hollow Ones, or whatever you want to call them, are just myths. She pushed past Ryan and led the way up the narrow trail, Jack trailing behind her with a roll of his eyes. Ryan stood still for a moment, staring at the forest that stretched out before him, a sea of ancient trees and thick fog that clung to the undergrowth. He couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, watching them with silent, unseen eyes. The whispers of the wind seemed to carry voices, soft, unintelligible murmurs that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Ryan quickened his pace to catch up with the others, but something deep within him couldn't dismiss the unease settling in his chest. He had read everything he could about the forest before the trip, but none of the stories really explained what happened to those who ventured too far. They all simply disappeared, never to be heard from again. Okay, what's the deal with you? Jack asked as Ryan approached, noticing his lingering hesitation. You're acting weird. Ryan shrugged, trying to shake off his discomfort. I'm fine, just thinking about how quiet it is. It's the woods, Eve called back, her voice strained with false cheer. It's supposed to be quiet. You're just not used to the isolation. You'll be fine once we get further in. They continued walking in silence, the trail narrowing as they pushed deeper into the woods. The air grew cooler, the dense canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. The shadows deepened around them, and the distant sound of a bird call echoed through the trees, startlingly loud in the otherwise perfect stillness. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing. A broken-down cabin sat in the middle of it, its wood aged and weathered by time. Its door hung loosely on its hinges, and the window panes were cracked, with bits of shattered glass scattered on the ground. The sight of the cabin sent a chill down Ryan's spine, despite the warmth of the day. Look at this place, Jack said, grinning. It's straight out of a horror movie. Let's go inside and see what we find. Eve's eyes narrowed. We're not going in there. But Ryan, drawn to it by some unknown force, took a step forward. What if someone lives here? He asked, curiosity overtaking caution. What if there's a reason this place is out here in the middle of nowhere? You know what's out here? Jack snapped, his voice suddenly harsh. Nothing. Just decay. Don't waste your time. Ignoring Jack's protest, Ryan walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry, brittle leaves. He could feel Eve's eyes on him, but the pull of the cabin was too strong to ignore. As he stepped onto the porch, the old wood creaked beneath his weight, and a strange sensation crawled up his spine. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting. Ryan reached for the door, pushing it open. It swung inward with an eerie screech, revealing a dark, dusty interior. Old furniture lay scattered about, covered in layers of rust. It was the walls. The walls were covered with drawings. Not the kind of casual sketches one might expect, but frantic, almost violent depictions of people, faces contorted in horror, hollow eyes staring out from the paper. Some of the figures had sharp teeth. Others seemed to be melting or distorting in unnatural ways. The symbols and marks surrounding the figures were unlike anything Ryan had ever seen before. Strange, looping lines and jagged shapes that seemed to writhe if he stared at them for too long. Ryan, Steve's voice called from the doorway, cautious. What are you looking at? Ryan tore his eyes away from the drawings, his heart pounding in his chest. Nothing. Just these drawings. They're not normal. Jack stepped in beside him and let out a laugh. Great. Now you found some creepy drawings. Let's get out of here. Ryan felt the weight of Eve's gaze on him as he backed away from the cabin. Something wasn't right. The cabin felt wrong, like it was meant to trap them here, to keep them from leaving. We should go, Eve said quietly, her voice carrying a note of urgency. This place gives me the creeps. Ryan nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something had just noticed them, something far older than the trees, something that lived in the quiet spaces between the shadows. As they turned to leave, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest whisper, a voice, distant and familiar, though unrecognizable. The forest was waiting. The hike continued, though the atmosphere had changed. Even Jack, who had been laughing off the eerie feeling in the cabin, was quieter now. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and every footstep seemed louder than the last. Ryan couldn't shake the image of the drawings in the cabin, those hollow eyes, the twisted figures. There had been something wrong about them, something alive, waiting in the dark corners of the room. The further they ventured into the forest, the more he felt the weight of the trees pressing in on him. The path ahead was narrowing, the dense underbrush closing in as though the woods were reclaiming the trail they had once walked. Let's stop for a break, Eve suggested, her voice tight. Her eyes scanned the forest as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Ryan nodded and dropped his pack beside a large rock. Jack flopped down beside him, his face pale. This place is messing with my head, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. I keep feeling like I'm being watched. Eve, who had been examining the surroundings, looked back at them. It's the woods. It does that to people, especially if they're not used to it. Just relax. But Ryan could see it in her eyes. She was just as uneasy as they were. The forest was vast and unyielding, and despite their careful preparation, they had ventured far beyond where anyone had been in years. That cabin was. Strange, Ryan said, breaking the silence. I keep thinking about those drawings. Those eyes. Eve grimaced. Don't let it get to you. The locals probably just left that place behind when they realized how dangerous it is out here. Ryan didn't buy it. There was more to it than that. The way the air had felt when he stepped inside, the whispers he could have sworn he heard, it was all too much to be dismissed as coincidence. He could feel the forest breathing, its presence like a living thing watching them, waiting. Jack leaned back against the rock, looking up at the canopy. What if those drawings were just made by someone who went nuts? People do weird things in isolation. There's something out here, Ryan murmured, staring into the depths of the forest. His pulse quickened as the trees seemed to shift, their limbs twitching in the breeze. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, a faint sound broke through the tension, the sound of footsteps approaching. Not their own. Did you hear that? Eve whispered, standing up. Ryan strained his ears, but all he could hear was the wind rustling the leaves. His stomach twisted. It's nothing. But as he spoke, the rustling grew louder, closer. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was heavy footfalls, purposeful, moving toward them. His heart started a race. "Someone's coming," Jack said, voice low. He stood up quickly, scanning the trees around them. Ryan's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, but there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the forest. The footsteps had stopped, but the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. "Maybe it's just another hiker," Eve suggested, though even her voice trembled slightly. Before Ryan could respond, he caught sight of something in the distance. A figure standing still, watching them. It was difficult to make out, just a silhouette against the dimming light, but there was something unmistakably unnatural about the way it stood, too still, too perfect in its stillness. It was as if it wasn't a person at all, but something pretending to be one. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. "We need to go. Now." He didn't wait for an answer. Without looking back, he grabbed his pack and started running. Eve followed immediately, Jack close behind, but the sense of being pursued was overwhelming. Every crunch of a twig underfoot sounded like a footstep just behind them. The trees seemed to close in as they pushed forward, the path narrowing, twisting. The air grew colder and the shadows deepened. No matter how fast they ran, the feeling that something was following, something that moved silently and swiftly, stayed with them. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the feeling of being watched disappeared. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell into a suffocating silence. Ryan slowed to a stop, panting. His eyes darted around. No sign of the figure. No sound. Just the wind and the rustling of leaves. "Okay, what the hell was that?" Jack demanded, his voice shaky. Eve, still breathing heavily, glanced over at Ryan, her face pale. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." The three of them stood there for a long moment. Each of them tried to steady their racing hearts. The path ahead was even darker now, the last vestiges of sunlight swallowed by the thick canopy. Ryan looked around, trying to ignore the pit of dread growing in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that the woods had just shifted, that something had changed. The forest wasn't just waiting anymore. It was moving. "Let's keep going," Ryan said, his voice low. "We'll find a clearing soon. We'll set up camp and stay the night." Eve nodded, though she didn't look convinced. She turned and started down the path again, with Jack reluctantly trailing behind. Ryan lingered for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the trees. But he saw nothing, nothing except the shadows stretching toward him, like fingers reaching out of the darkness. They weren't alone, and whatever was out there, whatever was watching them, wasn't going to let them leave. The path ahead seemed to stretch forever, the trees pressing in like walls on either side. Ryan could feel the oppressive weight of the forest, the sense that something was wrong, lurking just out of sight. He quickened his pace, but the air felt thicker with each step, heavier, as if the woods were closing in around them. Jack, ever the skeptic, was now unervingly quiet. His usual bravado had faded, replaced by the same unease Ryan had felt since the moment they'd set foot in the forest. Eve, too, was unusually silent, her eyes flicking constantly to the shadows that seemed to move just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Ryan could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She had been the most cautious of them all from the start, and now, with the creeping fear settling in, it seemed she was beginning to regret ever agreeing to this trip. "We should be getting close to a clearing," Ryan said, his voice betraying the anxiety building in his chest. "I read there's a campsite a little further in. It's a well-known spot. We'll be fine once we set up." Eve didn't respond right away. Her gaze was fixed on something in the distance, her brow furrowed in concentration. Ryan followed her stare, his heart leaping into his throat. There, through the trees, he saw something movement. A figure, barely visible, standing stock still in the underbrush, almost blending into the darkening woods. "Do you see that?" Ryan whispered, his voice tight. Eve's lips were pressed together, and she nodded slowly. "Stay quiet," she said. She reached for the knife at her belt, her fingers brushing the cold metal as she drew it. Jack glanced nervously at the figure, then back at Eve. "What is that? A person?" Eve shook her head, her eyes narrowed. "I don't know." For a long moment, none of them moved, the air thick with tension. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It was just there, watching them from the shadows, its face obscured by the dim light filtering through the trees. Ryan swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He could feel the weight of its gaze, like cold fingers brushing against his skin. Every instinct in him screamed to run, but his feet felt frozen to the ground. Without warning, the figure stepped forward, the motion unnervingly fluid and unnatural. Its face, hidden in shadow, was still impossible to make out, but Ryan could see the way its body moved, too smooth, too deliberate. There was no hesitation in its movement, no sign of fear or uncertainty. It knew they were there. "Run," Eve hissed, her voice barely a whisper, but it was already too late. Before they could react, the figure vanished into the darkness, the air around them suddenly still. It was as if it had never been there at all, leaving only the eerie silence behind. What the hell just happened? Jack breathed, his voice shaky. "We need to keep moving," Eve urged, her grip on her knife tightening. "Now!" They took off, the forest swallowing them up again as they rushed forward. The trees seemed to loom over them, their twisted branches reaching out like arms. The further they ran, the darker it became, the shadows growing deeper, longer. The path was no longer visible, swallowed up by the dense underbrush and the fog that had begun to creep in, wrapping around their legs like a living thing. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into a small clearing, a patch of grass, empty except for the ruins of an old stone fireplace in the center. It looked like a long-abandoned campsite, nothing more than a collection of weathered stones and broken branches. There was no sign of life, no warmth to the air, just the chill of the approaching night. "This will have to do," Eve said, her voice strained. "We set up here for now." Ryan nodded, though his gut told him it was a bad idea. He didn't want to stay. The forest felt wrong, like it was alive, like it was watching, waiting. But they had no choice. They were too far from the trail now to make it back before nightfall. As Eve and Jack began to set up the small tent, Ryan stood off to the side, scanning the trees. His mind raced, the image of that figure in the woods playing over and over in his head. What had it been? A rustling sound snapped him from his thoughts. He turned quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind had picked up again, but this time, the sound wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something distinct. A voice, faint but clear, calling from the edge of the clearing. "Help me." It was a soft, desperate whisper, barely audible over the sound of the wind. Ryan's blood ran cold. His breath caught in his throat. The voice, it sounded human. But that wasn't possible. The last person they'd seen had been in the woods, too far from here to reach them, too far to be calling for help now. Eve heard it too. She froze, her eyes wide, scanning the darkness around them. "Did you hear that?" Ryan nodded, his throat dry. "What the hell is going on?" The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Help me." It was close, too close, as if it were coming from just beyond the tree leaf. Jack, now beside them, looked around nervously. "What the hell? Should we go check it out?" "No." Eve's voice was firm, cold. She pulled Ryan and Jack closer to the campfire. "Stay here. Whatever that is, we're not going after it." Ryan's pulse hammered in his ears as the whispering continued. The voice was growing louder, the words more frantic. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. And then, in the dead of night, Ryan heard it, a sound he would never forget. The unmistakable crack of a branch snapping underfoot, followed by a soft shuffle in the dark. They weren't alone. The air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest like a weight. The crack of the branch echoed in Ryan's ears, and his heart raced. He strained his eyes, trying to peer into the inky darkness surrounding the clearing, but it was impossible to see anything beyond the faint glow of the campfire. "Did you hear that?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling. Eve held up a hand, silencing them. Her eyes were sharp, her senses alert. She turned slowly, scanning the edge of the clearing, her hand never straying far from the knife at her side. Ryan could see her muscles tense, every fiber of her being on edge. "I heard it," Ryan whispered back, his voice barely audible. It was close, too close. Another rustle, this time from behind them. The sound was soft, but unmistakable. Someone was moving through the trees, circling them, and it was getting closer. Ryan's breath hitched. The whispering voice had stopped, but the presence in the forest remained, like a shadow just out of sight. His pulse was pounding in his ears, and every nerve in his body screamed to run. But the woods felt like a trap, closing in from all sides. "We need to move," Eve said, her voice low but urgent. "Grab your stuff, now." But before any of them could react, a figure emerged from the darkness at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its movements were jerky, almost mechanical. It stood there for a long moment, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Ryan's stomach twisted into a tight knot, his breath coming faster. "Who's there?" Eve called out, her voice steady, but with a hint of panic she couldn't hide. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it just stood there, motionless like a part of the forest itself. Ryan couldn't make out its features, but he could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on them. Without warning, it stepped forward. The air grew colder. The fog, which had been creeping into the clearing since they had arrived, thickened, swirling around their feet like something alive. The figure's movements were too fluid, too perfect. Ryan's breath caught in his throat, his instincts telling him to run, but his legs refused to move. It took another step, and then another, closing the distance between them with an eerie certainty. Jack was the first to move, bolting toward the tent. "I'm not sticking around to find out what that thing is," he yelled, his voice hoarse with fear. Eve and Ryan followed, grabbing their packs as quickly as they could. Ryan's hands shook as he shoved his belongings into the bag, his eyes never leaving the figure in the clearing. It hadn't moved any closer, but its presence was suffocating, like a shadow hanging over them. "We're getting out of here," Eve hissed, already sprinting toward the edge of the clearing, away from the figure. Ryan followed without thinking, his legs moving on their own, the adrenaline of fear propelling him forward. The trees rushed past them as they pushed deeper into the forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick fog and underbrush. Ryan's heart was pounding in his chest, each beat a thunderous drum that seemed to echo in the still night air. The figure wasn't far behind them. Ryan could feel it in the way the air shifted, the way the wind seemed to bend and warp, like something was following, just on the edge of his perception. The forest felt alive, its whispers louder now, pressing in from all sides. "We have to stop," Eve said, her voice strained. She was gasping for breath, her face pale in the pale light of the moon. "We can't outrun it forever." Ryan's chest ached, his lungs burning. "We can't just stand here. We can't." But his words were cut off by a sudden, sharp noise, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. It was close, too close. Eve's eyes widened in terror. What the hell was that? Ryan looked around frantically, his eyes scanning the dark, thickened fog, but there was no sign of what was making the sound. The growl was followed by the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush, getting closer and closer. "It's not alone," Ryan said, his voice barely a whisper. Jack turned, his eyes wide with panic. "What do we do? What the hell do we do?" Eve's face was grim. "Stay together. Stay quiet. We need to find higher ground, get out of the open." They moved quickly, scrambling up a rocky incline that led to a small ridge, hoping that whatever was following them wouldn't be able to reach them if they got off the ground. As they climbed, Ryan's mind raced. Whatever was out there was unlike anything he'd ever imagined, something more ancient, more twisted than any creature he had ever heard of. It wasn't just a man. It wasn't even human. They reached the ridge and collapsed behind a cluster of boulders, trying to catch their breath. The growling continued, but now was joined by other noises, scraping, shuffling, the sound of something dragging through the dirt. Ryan tried to steady his breathing, but the sound of heavy footsteps was growing closer. "Keep quiet," Eve whispered, her eyes wide with fear as she peered over the top of the boulders. "Don't make a sound." Ryan nodded, his heart in his throat. He didn't dare move. He barely dared breathe. And then, just as suddenly as the sounds had started, they stopped. The forest went deathly quiet. The air felt still, too still, as if everything had paused, holding its breath. "What happened?" Jack murmured, barely able to keep his voice from shaking. "I don't know," Eve said. She glanced nervously around the ridge, her eyes flicking over the shadows as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. "I don't like it." Ryan's stomach twisted, a cold feeling creeping over him. The silence was worse than the growling had been. It was the calm before the storm, and he had this sinking feeling that whatever was out there, whatever had been following them, was waiting for something. Waiting for them to make a mistake. The silence dragged on, suffocating, as the three of them huddled behind the boulders. The forest around them felt vast and unknowable, the shadows stretching long and menacing in the dim moonlight. Ryan's heart thundered in his chest, every breath shallow, his skin prickling with the undeniable sense that they weren't just hiding from something, they were being watched. Jack was the first to break the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Eve didn't respond right away. She was still scanning the darkness, her eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of the chaos. "We wait," she said quietly. "We wait and we listen." Ryan's nerves were frayed. The longer they stayed here, the more he felt like they were just sitting ducks, exposed to whatever horrors lurked in the woods. He could still hear the low growl echoing through the trees, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his bones, the predator still out there somewhere. The forest felt alive, and not in the way it should. This place was wrong. Suddenly, there was another sound, a soft, almost imperceptible scraping noise from behind them. It was like fingernails dragging against bark. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He turned his head slowly, his eyes darting to the dark forest behind the ridge, but he couldn't see anything. "Did you hear that?" Jack whispered urgently. Eve nodded sharply. "Stay still." The noise came again, closer this time. Then there was a rustling in the underbrush. Ryan's pulse quickened. The forest was moving. Someone was out there, deliberately circling them. Jack's voice was tight with fear. What if it's not alone? What if it's... Before he could finish, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the ridge. It was tall, taller than any human, its limbs unnaturally long. Its body was a dark silhouette against the moonlight, features indistinguishable, just an outline of something that shouldn't exist. The creature moved with a kind of unnatural grace, each step calculated, its head swiveling slowly as though searching for something. Ryan's breath hitched in his throat. His mind screamed for him to move, to run, but his body betrayed him, frozen in place. It stepped closer. It was watching them, its gaze fixed, unblinking, but there was no expression on its face, just an emptiness that seemed to swallow the light around it. Eve's hand gripped Ryan's arm so tightly it almost hurt. "Don't move," she whispered. The creature's head tilted slightly, its form now visible enough to see the twisted, unnatural proportions of its body. Its skin was pale, almost gray, with patches of mottled discoloration, as though its flesh had been stretched too thin. The edges of its limbs seemed to shimmer in the low light, as if it wasn't quite real, but rather something imperfectly manifested. The growl rumbled again, this time much closer. The creature's eyes flicked to the trees, its body tense, as if it was listening. Then, without warning, it took another step toward them. Ryan couldn't help it anymore. He stood up, his legs shaking. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Eve grabbed his wrist, her grip like iron. "No, stay down. Don't let it see you." But it was too late. The creature's head snapped back to them, its gaze locking with Ryan's. For a split second, Ryan thought he saw something move in its eyes, something dark, shifting, almost alive. A cold chill ran down his spine as it took another step forward, and this time it didn't stop. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, but as it closed the gap, it became clear that it wasn't in any hurry. It knew exactly where they were. It wanted them to see it, to feel that bone-deep fear. Eve pressed herself flat against the ground, pulling Jack down with her. "Don't make a sound. Don't breathe too loud." But Ryan couldn't look away. He could feel the creature's presence like a weight in the air, suffocating him. Its gaze was unwavering, its movements deliberate. It was toying with them. The growl came again, but this time it wasn't just a growl. It was a guttural, terrifying sound, a sound that reverberated through the forest like an animal caught between life and death. It was as though the very earth trembled at its voice. Without warning, the creature lunged. Ryan's blood ran cold. His heart skipped a beat as he scrambled to his feet, his legs barely able to carry him. But it was too fast. Before he could move more than a few inches, the creature was already on top of him. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest as the creature's long, twisted hand clamped around his throat. The grip was ice cold, inhumanly strong. Ryan gasped, trying to breathe, but it was as if the air itself had been sucked from his lungs. With every ounce of strength he had left, he reached up to pry the creature's fingers from his throat, but it only tightened its grip. The edges of his vision began to blur, darkness creeping in from the edges of his mind. And then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the pressure eased. The creature's hand loosened, and it stepped back, leaving Ryan gasping for air, choking. He stumbled to the ground, trying to catch his breath. His skin was cold with sweat, his pulse hammering in his ears. The creature stood there, watching him with that same empty gaze, as if nothing had happened. Eve was on her feet now, pulling Ryan away from the creature. Jack was already several paces behind them, eyes wide with terror. "Go!" Eve shouted, her voice breaking. "Run!" They didn't need to be told twice. They bolted, running deeper into the forest, the creature's presence lingering behind them like a phantom, still watching, still waiting. The growls, the whispers, everything seemed to converge around them as they ran, the very forest alive with the sound of something hunting, something relentless. Ryan's legs burned, his chest heaving as he pushed himself forward, not daring to look back. He could hear the footsteps, the creatures drawing closer, the air thick with the promise of death. And then, in the distance, there it was, a faint glimmer of light. A way out? It had to be. The light ahead grew brighter with every desperate stride. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Ryan hope, a flicker in the suffocating darkness that had surrounded them. The distant glow was like a beacon, a lifeline in the oppressive night. But as they ran, the sound of movement behind them never stopped. The growls, the scraping, the distant whispers, all of it felt too close, too real. The creature wasn't far behind. Ryan could feel it, hear it, a pulse in the air that seemed to sync with his own heartbeat. "Keep going," Eve shouted, her voice raw with fear, but also with determination. "Don't stop. Not now." They ran faster, pushing through the thick underbrush, branches clawing at their faces, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Ryan's breath came in short, desperate gasps, his legs burning from the effort, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. Jack stumbled beside him, clearly exhausted. What if it's a trap? What if it's... Just keep running. Ryan snapped, his throat aching. His mind was spinning. The light wasn't far now. It had to be an exit, some kind of escape from this nightmare. But there was no time to think about it. They just had to make it. The growl came again, closer now, far too close. Ryan's blood ran cold, his stomach twisting into knots. He could hear the creature, feel its presence on the edge of his hearing, as though it was moving in and out of the shadows with inhuman speed. It was right behind them. It was hunting them. But then, just as quickly as the growl had appeared, everything fell eerily silent again. The whispers died. The shuffling ceased. The air felt almost still. Ryan risked a quick glance over his shoulder. His eyes went wide in terror as he saw it. The creature, standing motionless in the trees. It was too far to reach them now, but it was still watching, still waiting. Its silhouette stood stark against the dark backdrop of the forest, unnervingly calm. Eve was still running ahead of them, never slowing, her focus solely on the light ahead. "Stay with me," she said, her voice tight but unyielding. Ryan nodded, forcing himself to push forward. They were almost there. They had to be. The light was clearer now, just beyond a cluster of thick trees. It was faint, but unmistakable, a soft, flickering glow. It could have been a campfire, or maybe a lantern. Whoever, or whatever, had said it could be their salvation. But just as they neared the source of the light, a sudden, sharp noise cracked through the silence, loud and sudden. A snap, something heavy and massive moving through the trees. They froze, all three of them, hearts pounding. Then, the trees ahead parted, and another figure stepped into the clearing. It wasn't a creature, but it wasn't human either. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its features hidden beneath a dark, tattered cloak that seemed to move of its own accord, rippling unnaturally in the air. Its hands, long and twisted, gripped a large lantern, the flame flickering within, casting a pale light on its face, or rather, what should have been its face. Where its eyes should have been were only hollow, black voids, deep, endless pits of darkness that seemed to draw the light in. Its mouth was thin, twisted into a perpetual sneer, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that seemed far too large for any normal creature. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. This was no man, no wanderer lost in the woods. This was something other, something ancient and dark. The creature behind them was still there, just out of sight, watching. But this new figure didn't seem to care about the creature. It didn't look at it, didn't flinch when the growl echoed from the shadows. Instead, it turned its gaze toward Ryan and the others, its head tilting in that eerie, unnatural way, as though it was studying them. "You should not have come," the figure said, its voice a low rasp, barely a whisper beneath the rustling of the trees. It was almost as if the forest itself spoke through the figure's voice, ancient, otherworldly, and full of dread. Ryan's legs wobbled beneath him. He couldn't find his voice. "What are you?" Eve managed to force out, her voice barely above a whisper, but still firm despite the fear radiating from her. The figure tilted its head again, its hollow eyes never leaving her. "What am I?" "A poor question, child. I am the keeper of the forest, the one who watches. I am its warden, and I have allowed you to come this far." Ryan felt the air grow colder around him. The creature, the one that had been hunting them, was still there, and now it seemed to retreat deeper into the woods, its growl fading away. But something in the back of Ryan's mind told him it hadn't left. It was waiting, watching. It knew the warden. And that made everything far worse than it had been before. "Why did you stop us?" Jack asked, his voice shaking with uncertainty. "Why didn't you just let us leave?" The figure's lips curled into a twisted, cruel smile. "Because you were never meant to leave." It raised its lantern higher, and the glow from the flame intensified, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest takes in its own way. No one escapes once they've crossed its threshold. You're already bound to it. Ryan's throat tightened. He could feel it. The forest had changed. They weren't just running from a creature anymore. They were running from the forest itself. Something older, something far more powerful than any of them had imagined. The warden extended one bony hand toward them, and the air around it seemed to warp, like the world was bending beneath its power. "You'll never leave," it said, its voice now dripping with malice. "You'll become part of the forest, just like the rest." And with that, the warden stepped backward, fading into the shadows as the light from its lantern flickered and died, leaving them in a cold, suffocating darkness. The air around them seemed to freeze, thickening with an oppressive, unnatural stillness. The forest, once full of whispers and hidden movements, was now completely silent. The warden's disappearance into the shadows left the three of them standing in the middle of the clearing, their breath visible in the cold night air. Ryan's chest was tight, his head spinning with the words the warden had just spoken. "You'll become part of the forest, just like the rest." The image of the creature, still lurking somewhere in the darkness, clung to his mind, a nightmare that wouldn't let go. It wasn't just a monster. It was part of this place. And whatever the warden had meant, whatever power it had over the forest, they were now tied to it. Tied in a way they couldn't escape. "We have to move," Eve said, her voice shaky but filled with resolve. She turned toward the darkened woods at the edge of the clearing, already moving without a second thought. Those things will be back. We can't stay here." Ryan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He just followed her, Jack trailing behind him, each of them still trying to catch their breath, still reeling from the shock of everything they had just seen. The cold air bit at his skin, and the fog was thick again, clinging to their ankles as they moved further into the woods. The light they had seen, if it had ever really been there, was now nothing more than a fading memory. The forest was impenetrable again, the trees looming like silent sentinels around them. Ryan's mind raced, struggling to make sense of it all. What did the warden mean by the forest takes? What had gotten themselves into? Every step they took felt like they were sinking deeper into a nightmare, and the weight of the unseen presence pressing in around them only intensified. Jack's voice broke the silence. "What if we never leave? What if that thing, the warden, is right?" Eve didn't answer immediately. She didn't have to. The silence spoke for her. There were no guarantees in this place. No promises of safety. She just kept walking, and they followed, not daring to look back. The air grew even colder as they moved deeper, the fog thickening. It felt as though the woods were closing in on them. The path they were following seemed to wind aimlessly, as if it led nowhere at all, the trees growing more twisted and gnarled with every step. Then, a low growl echoed from somewhere in the distance, sending a jolt of terror through Ryan's spine. It wasn't the same growl from before. It was deeper, more menacing, and it carried with it the unmistakable sense that something wasn't right. It was a growl that reverberated in the earth beneath their feet. Ryan stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest. "We're being followed." Eve turned sharply, her eyes scanning the fog. "Stay quiet," she hissed. "We need to move faster." They started to walk briskly again, the sound of the growl still reverberating in their bones, but it wasn't just one growl anymore. It was a series of low, rumbling sounds, growls, snarls, and the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the brush, circling them, closing in from all sides. Ryan felt his pulse quicken. They were being hunted. "I'm not going to make it," Jack muttered, his voice trembling. "We're all going to die out here." "No," Eve snapped, her voice hard. "We'll find a way out. We just need to keep moving." But even as she spoke, Ryan could see the fear in her eyes. She was terrified, and for the first time, he wondered if she believed they could survive this. Another growl, louder, closer, then a rustle in the trees. Before they could react, the creature appeared in front of them. The creature from the clearing, its body silhouetted against the fog, its form like a twisted, towering nightmare. Its limbs were long and spindly, its eyes black voids that seemed to absorb the little light the moon offered. The same soulless, empty eyes. The same eerie, unnatural movements. The creature's mouth opened in a silent snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. And then with one swift, jerky motion, it lunged. Ryan's instincts kicked in before he could even think. He grabbed Eve's arm and pulled her back, throwing himself in front of her as the creature's outstretched hand reached for them. The creature's fingers brushed against his shoulder, cold, impossibly cold, and for a second, Ryan thought it might have torn his flesh open. But then, just as quickly as it had attacked, it stopped, standing still, its head tilted again in that unnerving way. Eve yanked Ryan back, pulling him toward Jack, both of them stumbling backward as they scrambled away from the creature. Ryan's heart pounded in his ears, but he couldn't look away from the creature's motionless form, now standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them intently, waiting for something. Why? Why isn't it attacking? Ryan gasped, his breath coming in jagged bursts. His whole body was shaking, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The creature took a slow, deliberate step toward them. The air seemed to shift around it, like it was feeding off the fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. But it didn't move closer. It was waiting. Eve, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and confusion, whispered, "It's not just hunting us. It's trying to get us to go somewhere. It's pushing us." The growls from the forest were growing louder, more intense. The presence of the warden, that twisted force that controlled this place, felt closer now, more oppressive, as if the very woods were closing in on them. Ryan's eyes flicked to the creature. Where? Where does it want us to go? Eve didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was clear as they turned to look at the growing blackness ahead of them, a mass of shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of its own, an unnatural void in the heart of the forest. And in that moment, Ryan understood. The forest didn't just want them lost. It didn't just want them to wander until they gave up and disappeared into the mist. No, it wanted them to reach that darkness. It wanted them to come to the heart of it all, where the warden ruled, where the forest's ancient hunger could swallow them whole. And the creature wasn't just hunting them anymore. It was guiding them. The cold weight of the warden's words hung in the air like a death sentence. For a moment, none of them moved. The clearing felt impossibly still, as though the entire forest had held its breath. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, his throat tight, like every word the warden had spoken was taking root inside him. "We need to run," Eve whispered, the terror now evident in her voice. She turned, grabbing Jack's arm, but he was rooted to the spot, staring at the now empty space where the warden had been. "No, we need to find a way out." Jack's voice cracked, and Ryan could hear the panic taking over his breath. His hands trembled as he looked around the clearing, eyes wild, searching for any kind of escape. But the forest had become a labyrinth. The path they had followed to the clearing was no longer visible. The trees seemed to have shifted, as if they had moved while they weren't looking, and the shadows had deepened, swallowing the ground in front of them. Ryan tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it wouldn't budge. His eyes scanned the thick mist that was now crawling along the forest floor, a heavy fog that made it impossible to see even a few feet ahead. It was like the forest itself was alive, twisting around them, cutting off their way out. "Eve," Jack's voice trembled. "What do we do?" Eve turned back toward the direction they'd come from, squinting into the fog. "We find a way out. We don't have time to waste." But as she moved, a strange, shuddering noise broke the stillness, a low, grinding, scraping sound, like something huge shifting beneath the earth. And then, all at once, the trees around them groaned, bending as if something massive was moving beneath the ground. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet. "Get back," Ryan shouted, his heart racing. He grabbed Eve's arm and pulled her back, but before they could react, the earth beneath them split. The ground cracked open with a deafening noise, splitting like a wound in the earth itself. From the gaping fissure, something massive began to emerge, blackened, twisted roots, gnarled and writhing like the limbs of a giant beast. The earth seemed to ripple as more roots and branches surged upward, reaching for the sky, reaching for them. The forest was alive, but not in the way it should be. It wasn't just trees and creatures anymore. It was the very land itself, and it was pulling them in. Ryan stumbled backward, his chest tight with fear. "We need to run." He grabbed Jack by the arm, pulling him along as the roots and branches stretched higher, darkening the sky above. Thump. The forest was moving, its pulse quickening. It was a trap. The warden had known this would happen. They weren't just fighting one creature. They were fighting the entire forest. Eve was already running ahead, her face determined but pale. "Keep moving," she shouted. But the roots weren't done. They surged forward, faster now, crashing through the trees and stretching toward them with terrifying speed. Ryan's feet slipped as he ran, his breath ragged and desperate. Jack's legs were giving out beneath him, exhaustion starting to take its toll. I can't. Keep going," he gasped, looking over his shoulder. "Don't stop." Ryan yelled, but it was too late. A massive root shot out from the darkness, wrapping around Jack's ankle with terrifying strength. He screamed, the sound echoing through the trees, but the forest didn't care. The root yanked him backward, dragging him into the darkness. "No!" Ryan cried out, reaching for Jack, but Eve pulled him away, her grip like steel. "We can't help him," Eve shouted, her voice breaking. "We have to get out of here." The forest was closing in on them, the roots stretching ever closer. Ryan could hear Jack's frantic screams fading into the distance, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "Keep running," Eve urged, her voice strained. "We don't have time." Ryan felt like he was suffocating. Every step he took felt heavier, like the forest was pulling him down, trying to drag him into its depths. The mist was so thick now that it was hard to see anything beyond a few feet. The air was thick, filled with the sounds of the forest, the thing that had been hunting them, the whispers of something ancient, and the relentless thrum of roots and branches moving beneath them. And then a terrible thought crossed his mind. What if they couldn't escape? What if they had been brought here, lured into this nightmare, only to become another part of the forest? Was there any way out of this place? Or had the warden spoken the truth? Once you entered, there was no leaving? Another loud crack echoed through the woods, and Ryan's heart leapt into his throat. The ground beneath him trembled again, but this time, the tremor was different. It was deeper, more powerful. The entire forest was shifting. Suddenly, there was a blur of movement in the mist, a shape darting between the trees, moving far too fast for any human. Ryan froze, his body tensing. He couldn't tell if it was the creature or something worse. "Stay together," Eve whispered urgently, her eyes darting around. "Stay close." But just as they moved forward, a new sound cut through the air, a sound unlike any they had heard before. It was a high-pitched, piercing screech, like metal being dragged across stone. It was shrill and endless, reverberating through their skulls. And then, from the mist, it appeared. A creature that was both human and not. A twisted, skeletal form, its skin hanging in tatters, its eyes empty pits of blackness. Its mouth gaped open, a gurgling hiss emanating from deep within its throat. It moved toward them with unnatural speed, and Ryan's blood ran cold. This was no longer just a monster, it was a harbinger. A creature born from the forest itself, twisted by its dark magic, and it wasn't just hunting them. It was there to finish what the warden had started. Eve didn't hesitate. She pulled Ryan to his feet, her face set with grim determination. "We have to get to the heart of the forest," she said, her voice hoarse. "That's the only way out." Ryan's mind raced, but before he could argue, the creature lunged, its mouth snapping open wide to devour them whole. The creature's jaws gaped open, the blackness of its mouth endless, its gurgling hiss cutting through the cold night air like a blade. Ryan's pulse thundered at his ears. There was no time to think, only to run. Eve yanked him forward, and the two of them sprinted, the sound of the creature's claws scraping the earth just behind them, the screeching filling the air. The forest around them seemed to come alive, trees groaning and creaking as though they were bending toward them, their branches stretching out like grasping hands. The roots on the ground slithered beneath the fog, trying to trip them, to pull them down, to drag them into the depths of the earth. Ryan didn't dare look back, but he could hear the creature's footsteps, fast, rhythmic, the sound of something far too large moving in the fog, something hungry and relentless. "We're almost there," Eve panted, her voice sharp with urgency. "The heart of the forest. It's close. We can make it." Ryan wanted to believe her. He had to believe her, but the words felt hollow against the gnawing dread in his chest. The ground shook again, as if the earth itself was warning them of the horrors that lay ahead. The very air felt thick with malice, as though the trees were watching, waiting for them to fail. Behind them, the creature let out another bone-chilling screech, a sound that twisted Ryan's insides, as though it was pulling at his very soul. It was gaining on them, drawing closer with every step. He could hear Eve's breath quickening, her footfalls in time with his own. But even as they ran, Ryan could feel something strange in the air, a shift, a pull towards something. Wrong. Something that wasn't just a monster. It was the forest itself. The darkness. A crack of thunder rumbled through the sky, though the air remained still and heavy. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A clearing. But it wasn't like the others they'd passed through. This one was vast and empty, a wide, barren expanse, surrounded by thick, twisted trees that seemed to be bending inward. A place of unnatural silence. And in the middle of it, a towering figure, a statue? No, not a statue. It was a monument, made of stone and roots, a grotesque thing that seemed to pulse with an ancient power. Ryan's blood ran cold. That was it. The heart of the forest. They had reached it. Eve's eyes were fixed on it. "There," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's where we need to go." But the moment the words left her lips, the forest around them seemed to change. The trees shrieked, their limbs twisting and groaning, their trunks contorting unnaturally. The ground began to buckle and shift beneath them as the earth split open, revealing dark, gaping holes that seemed to stretch down into an endless abyss. The creature was no longer just behind them. It was everywhere, its presence all around them, its screeches filling the air like a choir of death. And the fog was getting thicker, blinding, suffocating. "Moo!" Ryan shouted, pulling Eve toward the monument. But the ground beneath them buckled again, and they were forced to leap to avoid being swallowed by the chasm that seemed to open up at their feet. They were close now. So close. The monument's dark, twisting figure loomed above them, its roots crawling across the ground, reaching for them. The air felt alive, charged with something ancient and terrifying. The warden had said the forest took, and now they could feel it. It was taking everything, their hope, their safety, their very will to survive. "Why isn't it attacking?" Eve gasped, looking around, her voice trembling. "Why aren't we dead yet?" Ryan didn't answer. He was too focused on the monument, the twisted figure that seemed to pulse with some kind of strange life. His skin prickled. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. But he knew they had no choice. With a burst of strength, they reached the base of the monument, panting heavily. But just as Ryan's hand reached for the twisted stone, the ground shook violently beneath them. The creature screeched again, and Ryan spun, only to see the shadow rising from the fog, a shape much larger than before, its limbs stretched out like black tendrils. It was everywhere now, and the air, thick, stifling, suddenly became alive. "I knew you would come." A voice echoed, deep and ancient, yet familiar, as though it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ryan's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was the warden. It was the forest itself. The monument in front of them began to shift, the roots twisting and contorting, reshaping into something far worse than they could have imagined. And then, with a sudden, unnatural movement, the statue's twisted face opened, a mouth gaping wide, revealing endless darkness inside. And then it spoke again. "You are here. You are part of the forest now. There is no leaving. There is no escape." Ryan's stomach churned. This wasn't just about survival. This was a ritual, a trap, designed to pull them into the heart of the forest, to claim them as its own. Eve began, but her voice was cut off by another deafening scream. She grabbed Ryan's arm, her fingers tightening in panic. "What do we do?" Ryan's mind raced, his pulse racing, but before he could answer, the creature, the thing they had been running from, lunged toward them, its limbs twisting impossibly fast. Its maw opened wide, and Ryan saw nothing but endless darkness within. A sudden flash of movement from the trees, the roots, the real roots, snaked out, wrapping around the creature's legs, holding it in place. And then a voice that was not the warden's, but familiar, called out from the darkness. "Run!" It was Jack, his voice. But where was he? Ryan didn't think twice. He pulled Eve with him and bolted toward the opening beneath the monument's dark, twisted figure. The forest was trying to pull them back, to drag them down, but they couldn't stop now. The creature howled in fury as they raced toward the entrance of the monument. The roots thrashed, tearing at the air, but Ryan pushed forward. If they were going to survive, they had to trust that whatever Jack was doing, whatever was waiting for them on the other side, was their last chance. They reached the entrance, just as the monument's darkness swallowed them whole. The creature lunged at them with terrifying speed, its skeletal frame twisting and jerking like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. Its black eyes bore into Ryan, hollow and soulless, as its mouth gaped open, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. The air seemed to warp around it, the forest holding its breath as the thing closed in. Ryan's heart slammed against his chest, and for a brief, panicked moment, he thought he might freeze. But then Eve grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the dense trees. "Move!" she shouted, her voice raw with panic. The creature's screech echoed in their ears, the horrible sound vibrating in their bones. It was too close, too fast. Ryan ran with everything he had, his breath coming in shallow bursts, the mist closing in around them. His legs burned, but there was no time to stop. Behind him, he heard the creature's shrill wail again, the sound bouncing off the trees, getting closer. It was gaining. Then, just as they reached a dense thicket of thorns and brambles, Eve yanked him to a stop, pulling him low to the ground. Jack was gone. They couldn't afford to look back. "Get down," Eve hissed, and Ryan instinctively crouched, his hand gripping the earth beneath him as the creature's shadow passed overhead. For a moment, everything was quiet. The creature's hissing breaths were the only sound, punctuated by the soft rustle of leaves. Ryan's chest heaved with the effort to stay still, his entire body vibrating with the need to move, to escape. But he knew that the slightest sound could give them away. He forced his breathing to slow, straining to listen. The creature's footsteps grew fainter, but Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting, lurking just out of sight. It was the forest, too. He realized the way the trees twisted and shifted with every step. It felt like everything around them was alive, watching them, judging them. "We need to keep moving," Eve whispered urgently, but Ryan felt a heavy sense of dread settle in his gut. "We'll never outrun it," Ryan muttered, staring into the gloom ahead. There was no path, twisting trees, the same dead branches that led them nowhere. The heart of the forest felt like a trap, a maze designed to ensnare them forever. But Eve wasn't listening. She was already moving, her body tense, her eyes scanning the forest as if searching for something. "Eve," Ryan whispered, "what are you doing?" She didn't look back as she picked her way through the dense underbrush. "We need to get to the center. The heart. It's the only place that can stop this." Ryan opened his mouth to protest, but the sound of branches snapping behind him made him freeze. A deep growl rumbled in the distance, too close. The creature had found them again. His mind raced. The heart of the forest. What did she mean? Could it really stop whatever this was? The warden had said the forest took what it wanted. But what if the only way to truly escape was to surrender to it? What if there was no way out? "Eve, wait." Ryan called, but she was already ahead of him, disappearing into the thick fog. The growls were closer now. The creature was coming for them. The ground beneath Ryan's feet seemed to shift, and the trees loomed over him like dark, twisted hands reaching for him. He had no choice. He had to follow. Ryan pushed forward through the dense thorns, stumbling over roots and branches, trying to keep up with Eve's frantic pace. His legs felt like lead, but he pushed through, adrenaline keeping him moving even as exhaustion threatened to pull him under. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The forest was closing in on them, the trees narrowing until there was barely room to move between them. The mist thickened, swirling around his ankles like a living thing. The air was heavy with something old, something suffocating. Then he saw it, a clearing ahead. The trees parted just enough to reveal a massive stone structure, ancient, weathered, and covered in vines. It looked like a ruin, something forgotten by time. But as Ryan drew closer, he realized it wasn't just a ruin. The stones hummed with an energy, an unsettling vibration that seemed to ripple through the very air. Eve had stopped in the middle of the clearing, her eyes wide as she looked up at the stone structure. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the heart." Ryan stepped forward, but the moment he crossed into the clearing, the ground trembled beneath his feet, and a strange force pressed down on him, as if the entire forest was alive and aware of his presence. He felt a cold draft, and then, from the dark shadows of the trees, something else emerged. It wasn't the creature. It wasn't the warden. It was something older, something far darker. A figure cloaked in black robes, its face hidden beneath a hood. In one hand, it held a twisted staff, and in the other, a lantern that flickered with a sickly green flame. Its presence was oppressive, like a weight pressing down on Ryan's chest, suffocating him. The figure was ancient, its power palpable in the air. And when it spoke, its voice was not a voice at all, but a cold whisper that slid into their minds like ice. "You should not have come," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the very stone of the ruin. Ryan's blood ran cold. He looked at Eve, who was standing frozen, her face pale with fear. "What is that thing?" he whispered. Eve's voice trembled. "It's the keeper of the heart, the guardian of the forest's true power." The figure raised its staff, and the stone structure around them began to hum with energy. The ground cracked open, and roots shot up from the earth, curling like tendrils toward them. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. What does it want with us? The figure's hooded face seemed to tilt toward him, as if considering the question. "You were brought here for a reason," it whispered, its voice like the creaking of old wood. "The forest has chosen, and now you'll be bound to it, just as the others before you." Eve's eyes widened in horror. "No," she whispered. "We don't belong here. We just want to leave." The figure let out a soft, mirthless laugh. "There is no leaving. Once the forest has claimed you, there is no escape." Ryan's chest tightened. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, as if the forest itself was tightening its grip on them, ready to drag them into the abyss. The keeper of the heart raised its staff, and the dark energy of the forest surged toward them. And then, as the roots and vines closed in, Ryan realized the truth. The forest had never intended to let them leave. It was hungry, and they were the feast. The energy in the air thickened, pressing down on Ryan's chest as the keeper's staff glowed brighter, casting an eerie green light across the clearing. The roots that had shot up from the ground coiled around the air, twisting and writhing like serpents, their tips glowing with that same sickly green hue. The earth beneath them seemed to breathe, its pulse quickening as the forest grew more alive with each passing second. Ryan's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything else. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. The very air felt oppressive, as though the forest itself was squeezing the life out of him. "We can't stay here," Eve whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "We have to run. There's still a chance." But it wasn't that simple anymore. The roots were everywhere, stretching out in every direction, curling toward them like the fingers of a giant hand. The trees overhead groaned, their trunks bending as if the forest itself was closing in on them. "You cannot escape," the keeper's voice echoed in Ryan's mind, soft but insistent. It was the voice of the forest itself, ancient and endless. "You are already part of the forest. You will feed it, as those before you have." Ryan's heart raced. The weight of the keeper's words hung heavily in the air, like a curse that had been placed on them the moment they had stepped into this place. He looked around, desperate for any way out, but there was nothing. The monument behind him loomed like a dark god, its roots reaching toward the sky. The clearing was shrinking, the earth buckling as more roots surged up from below. "Please," Eve's voice cracked. "We don't belong here. We didn't mean to." But before she could finish, the keeper's cold, hollow gaze turned to her. It stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural, as if it were both a part of the earth and separate from it. The dark cloak it wore billowed with an unseen wind, and the lantern in its hand flickered, casting distorted shadows across the clearing. "You belong," the keeper whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "The forest has chosen you. There is no escape now." Ryan's mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be something they could do. But the longer he stood there, the more the weight of the forest pressed down on him. The fog had thickened to the point where he could barely see beyond a few feet, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward them with a life of their own. Suddenly, a memory flashed in his mind, something he'd heard in passing, something about the ancient rituals of the forest. His eyes widened as a realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. "Eve," he gasped. "The heart, the center, it's not just a place. It's a source." Eve's eyes widened in confusion. "What are you talking about? What source?" "The warden said it. The forest takes what it wants. It doesn't just devour, it feeds. But the heart of the forest, the center, is the source. The power is there. We could use it." Eve shook her head. "But how? How do we use it?" Ryan didn't know, but there was no time to waste. He grabbed Eve's arm, pulling her toward the dark monument behind them. The keeper watched them, but didn't move. The roots were now just inches from their feet, creeping up from the ground like veins in a living organism. "Focus," Ryan snapped. "We have to reach the heart." They ran, pushing through the thick fog and the creeping roots. But every step was heavier than the last, as though the forest itself was fighting them. The earth buckled beneath their feet, and the air grew thicker with every passing second. The roots lashed out, snapping at them like tendrils of some giant beast, but Ryan and Eve pressed on, their eyes fixed on the dark stone monument ahead. Behind them, the keeper's voice echoed in their minds again, cold and unyielding. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. This is where you belong." Ryan didn't stop. He couldn't stop. They had to get to the center of the monument, to the heart of the forest. The power of the forest was here. They just needed to reach it before it consumed them completely. When they finally reached the monument, Ryan hesitated, his fingers brushing against the dark stone. The surface was smooth, cold, and impossibly ancient. There was no sign of a door, no opening to speak of, only the twisted roots that curled around the base of the structure, tightening as if guarding whatever lay beyond. Eve was breathing heavily, her hands trembling as she looked up at the monument. How do we get in? Ryan's eyes darted around the structure, searching for something, anything, that would give them an answer. That's when he saw it, an inscription carved deep into the stone. At first, it was barely visible, hidden beneath the roots, but as he leaned closer, he could just make out the ancient runes, a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. It was a warning, a binding spell, but there was something else there, a clue. A single phrase at the end of the inscription, only those who are willing to give their life may pass. Give their life, Eve echoed. What does that mean? Before Ryan could respond, the ground trembled beneath them once more, and the keeper's cold laugh echoed through the clearing. It was too late. They had no choice. The roots were already closing in on them, the earth itself beginning to crack. Ryan had an idea of what he had to do, but he wasn't sure if it would work. We need to sacrifice something, he said, breathless. It's not just us. It wants something from us, our blood, our essence. The heart of the forest feeds on sacrifices. We need to give something of ourselves to it. Eve looked at him, horror crossing her face. You mean us? Ryan nodded. It's the only way. The moment the words left his mouth, the keeper's laughter intensified, vibrating through the air. The roots twisted and turned, tightening their grip on the earth, as if the forest was preparing to swallow them whole. Ryan reached into his pocket, pulling out the small blade he had kept hidden. He knew it was time. He had to give a piece of himself to this place if they were to have any chance of survival. Eve's eyes widened, and she shook her head in desperation. No, there has to be another way. But Ryan could already feel the pull of the forest, the call of the heart drawing him in. There was no time left for doubt. Without another word, he raised the blade. Ryan's hand shook as he gripped the blade, the cold steel pressing against his palm. His pulse was a steady thrum in his ears as he held it above his skin, the dark, oppressive weight of the forest closing in on him. Eve's eyes were wide with terror, her body trembling as the roots continued to snake out toward them. Ryan, don't do it, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the wind that seemed to be picking up, pulling the mist even thicker around them. There's got to be another way. But Ryan didn't know if there was. He could feel the heartbeat of the forest beneath his feet, pulsing like some great, monstrous thing, hungering for the life of everything around them. It was alive. It was sentient, and it wanted them. In a sudden, desperate surge, the roots shot out, wrapping around his legs, holding him in place. The monument ahead of them hummed with dark energy, its power growing stronger with every passing second. Ryan could hear the keeper's voice again, curling into his mind, cold and mocking. You cannot fight it. You cannot hide. You are mine now. Eve screamed, her hands trying to pry the roots away from Ryan, but they only grew tighter. The stone monument seemed to groan, and the earth split open, revealing black, tar-like veins beneath the surface, pulsating like a living organism. The forest was no longer a mere place. It was a being, and it was awake. Ryan's mind swirled with panic, but as he looked into Eve's eyes, he saw something else, something even darker. The forest wasn't just pulling at them. It was pulling at her, too. The keeper had said it. You are part of the forest now. He had no choice. He had to act before the forest took them both. His hand tightened around the blade as he brought it down swiftly, cutting across his palm. Pain erupted through his arm, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming surge of energy that followed. The blood that spilled from his wound seeped into the earth beneath him, and the forest seemed to shudder, the roots tightening even more, like they were feeding. But it wasn't enough. The forest wasn't satisfied. More, the keeper's voice whispered, its tone even colder, more insistent now. Feed me more. Ryan's vision blurred, his breath ragged as his blood soaked into the ground, the earth greedily consuming it. He felt lightheaded, as if his very soul was being drained. And in that moment, he realized the truth. The forest didn't just want their lives. It wanted their essence, their memories, their hopes, their very souls. No, Eve cried, her hands still pulling at the roots around Ryan's legs, her voice a mixture of fear and fury. You can't give it that. You can't give it your soul. But even as she screamed, the forest seemed to deepen its grip on him. His mind felt like it was slipping away, the dark energy of the forest clouding his thoughts, his body growing colder, slower. His blood, his very lifeblood, was the fuel the forest needed to sustain itself. Ryan looked at Eve one last time. She was struggling, her face twisted in anguish, but there was a resolve in her eyes, a determination that was contagious. He realized, in that moment, that he didn't have to give it everything. He didn't have to sacrifice himself entirely. There was another way. With a violent surge of strength, he yanked his leg free from the roots, his hand still pressed tightly against the bleeding wound. The dark energy pulsed violently beneath him, but he managed to stagger to his feet, dragging Eve with him. "Eve, we fight," he shouted, his voice hoarse and raw with desperation. She didn't hesitate. In that instant, she understood. The moment the keeper saw their resolve, its eyes, if it had eyes, narrowed, its mouth opening in a silent scream, the dark power of the forest roaring in fury. "You cannot defy me," it bellowed, its voice shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Ryan's heart raced, his blood burning in his veins, as a new force surged through him. The energy from the monument, the ancient power beneath them, seemed to rise to meet his will. It was as if the forest itself was reacting to their defiance. Ryan took Eve's hand, and they rushed forward toward the center of the monument. The keeper screeched in fury, but they didn't stop. With each step, the ground seemed to fight them, but their combined will began to push back against the roots, against the monument's dark pull. The stone before them cracked as they reached the heart of the monument, a deep, thunderous crack that echoed through the clearing. A bright flash of light erupted from the center, blinding them momentarily. When Ryan's vision cleared, he saw it. The heart of the forest beating like a great, twisted heart. It was a swirling mass of dark energy and light, the source of the power that had been consuming them. It was alive. It was a god, but it was weak. The blood that Ryan had spilled had fed it, but it had also weakened it. The forest had been drawing from them, using them as fuel, but the moment they had made the choice to fight back, to defy the forest, something inside it had snapped. Ryan stepped forward, blood still dripping from his palm, and as he did, the heart of the forest pulsed again, but this time, it was faltering. The light within it dimmed. The roots that had coiled around them began to loosen, their grip weakening. Eve's voice was barely a whisper, but it was full of the same determination. "We can end this." Ryan nodded. Together, they approached the heart, their hands still joined. The forest had taken so much, but now it was time to take it back. The moment their hands touched the core, a jolt of energy ripped through them. Pain so intense it felt like their very bones were being shattered. Their bodies screamed in agony, but they held on. They had no choice. With one final, desperate push, they willed the heart of the forest to die. They pulled at it, as if tearing it out from the very earth. The energy that had bound them began to crack and splinter, the light dimming until it was gone entirely. The roots that had once bound them shriveled and died, their grip releasing entirely as the forest's hold broke. And then, silence. The forest fell still. Ryan collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, blood still trickling from his palm. Eve was beside him, her face pale, her hands trembling, but they were free. The keeper's voice was no longer present. The earth beneath them, the roots, the monument, they were all silent, still, as if the forest had finally released them. But as Ryan looked around, he realized something had changed. The darkness that had once permeated every inch of the forest was now gone. The trees still stood, the monument still loomed in the distance, but it was no longer alive. The forest that had once hunted them was now silent. We did it, Eve whispered, her voice trembling with both disbelief and relief. Ryan nodded slowly, his mind still reeling from the pain, the darkness, the power of the heart. We did, but as he looked at the monument one last time, something twisted in his gut, a lingering sense of unease. They had fought back. They had survived. But the forest, was it truly gone? Or had they only driven it deeper into the shadows, waiting for the next time it would awaken? Either way, they had survived. For now. Ryan sat in the now-still clearing, his bloodied hand resting on the ground, but he barely noticed the pain. Eve was beside him, both of them leaning against the remnants of the ruined monument, their ragged breaths the only sound in the vast, quiet expanse of the forest. The darkness that had consumed everything earlier had receded, leaving an unsettling calm in its wake. It felt as though the world had held its breath, and now was slowly exhaling, but something didn't feel right. The forest, though still, seemed to be waiting, watching, waiting for something. Do you think it's really over? Eve asked, her voice trembling as she glanced nervously at the trees, as if expecting the earth to suddenly swallow them whole. Ryan didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. He didn't know. The trees that had once twisted like monstrous fingers now stood still, like silent sentinels in the fog. The roots that had once been their prison lay lifeless, entangled in the dirt, like broken veins. The air was thick with a musty scent of decay, yet there was something faintly new in the atmosphere, like a storm had just passed through, leaving a stillness that seemed unnatural. I don't know, Ryan said finally, his voice low. It feels over, but he stood, wiping the blood from his hand onto his pants as he gazed around the forest. It had been so alive, so hungry, so alive in a way that defied everything he had understood about nature. But now it was eerily silent. Too silent. Eve stood beside him, her eyes scanning the trees. Her expression was one of wariness, alert, like she was waiting for the ground to crack open again. She couldn't shake the feeling, and neither could Ryan. They were both so certain that they had ended it, but some lingering dread gnawed at the edges of their thoughts. I don't like this, Eve muttered, her hand curling into a fist. There's something about this place. I don't trust it. It's empty now. Ryan swallowed, his throat dry. Empty. We're waiting. The word hit him like a jolt of cold electricity, and he felt his skin tighten. He wasn't sure what he meant by it, but there was an unmistakable sense that something hadn't been fully finished. That whatever had been trapped in the forest might still be there, deep beneath the roots and stone. Something ancient, something far older than they could ever understand. A power that had been contained by the monument, and maybe, just maybe, that power hadn't been fully destroyed. It had only been released. The trees groaned gently in the wind, their branches swaying, but Ryan didn't believe it was the wind. He felt it, a faint ripple, like the ground itself was stirring, waking from a deep slumber. No, he muttered under his breath. It can't be. But even as the words left his lips, the ground beneath them trembled. A faint rumble, just beneath the surface, sending shivers through the leaves. And then it grew, faint at first, like the rumble of distant thunder, but growing louder, closer. Eve's eyes snapped wide with terror. No, 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 no. Before either of them could react, the ground split. A gaping crack in the earth tore open, jagged and violent. The dark soil of the forest splintering apart like some monstrous jaw opening wide to consume them. The sound was deafening, a sharp, shrill tearing, like fabric being ripped from the seams. Ryan grabbed Eve, pulling her back just as the roots of the monument shot out from the ground, twisting with unimaginable speed, like serpents springing to life. They arced toward them, stretching from the cracks in the earth as if hungry for more. The forest was waking again, but this time it wasn't the same. The trees themselves seemed to twist in agony, their trunks bending unnaturally, and the dark energy Ryan had felt before, that sense of living darkness, began to seep from the cracks. It was the forest's true heart, not the monument, not the keeper. This was the power of the forest itself, the forest that had always been alive, always watching, always waiting. Ryan stumbled back, pulling Eve away from the writhing roots that were crawling toward them, but the ground seemed to buck beneath them. The monument had split wide open, revealing an endless chasm beneath it, glowing with that same otherworldly, sickly light. "No!" Eve shouted, panic rising in her voice. "What is this? We did everything. We stopped it. We..." But her voice faltered as the air grew thick with the scent of rotting earth, the very ground around them seeming to pull them toward that dark chasm. Something deep below was stirring, and then they saw it. A dark figure, half formed from the shadows of the trees, emerging from the split in the earth. It was the keeper, or at least something that was the keeper, only this time it was not cloaked in black. It was more. Formless. A grotesque shape made of shifting shadows and roots. A figure that seemed to flow between the trees like a living nightmare, but with no clear shape or purpose. Its eyes glowed faintly within the swirling mass, and its mouth, wide, gaping, and full of jagged teeth, opened slowly in a silent, grotesque smile. It wasn't just a warden anymore. It was something far worse. It was the spirit of the forest itself, the true heart of the ancient power that had been bound long ago. "You cannot stop me." Its voice echoed in their minds, rasping like 1,000 voices mingling in a single, horrid whisper. Ryan's heart raced, his blood pounding in his ears as the forest closed in around them. The roots began to rise again, faster, more aggressive this time, and the trees shifted, their branches no longer gentle, but sharp, reaching out like claws, scraping across the ground. Eve's face was pale, her hands trembling as she reached for Ryan's arm. "We have to do something. We can't fight this." But Ryan wasn't listening. He could feel it now, the pull of the forest, the hum of its power vibrating in his bones. The feeling of inevitability, the sense that this was always going to happen, that no matter what they had done, no matter how much they fought, the forest would always find a way back. "It's never over," Ryan whispered hoarsely. "It's never over." The figure that had once been the keeper seemed to flow across the ground, an ever-shifting mass. It was as though the very earth, its form rising from the deep cracks in the earth where the forest heart had once pulsed. And now, it had returned, not as a guardian, but as something far worse, something older, darker, and more malevolent than Ryan could have imagined. Eve clung to Ryan, her breath sharp, ragged, her eyes darting around as if searching for any escape. But there was none. The roots were rising from the ground, coiling around them like living chains, too fast, too many to avoid. The trees groaned, their trunks twisting as though the forest itself was stretching, preparing for something. Ryan could feel the pulse of it in the air. The forest wasn't just alive, it knew them. It knew him. They had come to the center of its power, and in doing so, they had awakened something far worse than they had anticipated. We, we can't fight it, Eve whispered, her voice barely audible as she looked at the figure that had once been a keeper. Her eyes were filled with dread, the realization sinking in. It's not just the forest. It is the forest. The entity, the spirit, the keeper, it seemed to smile, or at least Ryan thought it did. Its features were indistinct, a void of shadows swirling with flashes of light. But the presence of its malice was unmistakable. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't a warden. It was something far worse, an ancient consciousness, an elemental force that had slumbered beneath the earth for millennia. "You are too weak," it whispered into their minds, its voice like the grinding of roots beneath the earth, the crackling of leaves in a forgotten graveyard. "You have fed me, but you have not understood. You are part of me. You are mine now." Ryan felt the world around him twist. The forest was closing in, its roots pushing through the ground, the trees leaning toward them like giants about to strike. The weight of it pressed down on him. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the once lush greenery had turned to an overwhelming, suffocating blackness. Eve's grip tightened on his arm, her voice desperate. "We can't fight it. We have to run." But Ryan couldn't tear his eyes away from the dark shape of the spirit. Every instinct in his body told him they were not just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for everything. Their freedom, their memories, their very existence. The keeper, or whatever this was not just a manifestation of the forest. It was a prison, and they had unwittingly opened its gate. Ryan's chest tightened as the roots began to curl tighter around them. His mind raced, searching for something, anything that could save them. But the more he thought, the more he realized how helpless they were. The forest had always been in control. Even when it had seemed like they had defeated it, they had only played into its hands. And then, in a flash of clarity, Ryan remembered. The heart of the forest, the energy it fed on, it wasn't just about blood. It wasn't just about sacrifice. The true power of the forest lay in its ability to consume. It could take everything from them. Their memories, their emotions, their very souls. It had taken their blood, yes. But it had also taken something more, their very essence, their fears, their deepest desires. That's how the forest lived, how it thrived. It didn't just need physical sacrifice, it needed to consume them, to feed on their lives, their pasts, their very existence. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. "We have to stop it here," Ryan said, his voice low, barely a whisper. "We have to cut it off." "What?" Eve's voice was filled with confusion, but there was an edge of desperation there, too. "How? What are you talking about?" Ryan didn't know how, but in his gut he knew. This thing that had once been the keeper was only part of the forest's power. The forest wasn't just alive. It was conscious, and it had made them part of it. It had bound them, as it had bound so many before. And there was only one way to break that bond. Without a second thought, Ryan turned toward the ground, kneeling, his fingers scraping against the earth. He didn't have a plan, not really, but he felt the pulse beneath him, the deep thrumming energy of the forest. He had to sever the connection. The moment his hands touched the ground, a searing pain shot through him. His blood began to burn, his skin cracking where his hands met the earth, as if the forest itself was trying to pull him in. But Ryan didn't let go. He gripped the earth, using the pain, using the fire in his veins to focus his will. "Ryan, no," Eve screamed, her hands trying to pull him away, but he couldn't stop. "You're burning yourself, stop." But he couldn't stop. The ground was alive, and he was not going to let it take him. Not again. And then he heard it, the voice. A deep, guttural whisper that filled the very air around them, slithering into his thoughts like a cold serpent. "You are mine," it hissed. "You cannot escape." But Ryan refused. With every ounce of strength, he pushed forward, reaching deeper, searching for the source of the power. The pulse under his fingers grew louder, stronger, more intense. The forest screamed around him, the earth cracking beneath his grip, but Ryan wouldn't let go. "I am not yours," he roared, his voice shaking with the force of his words. The moment he said it, the ground shuddered. The air grew thick with a blinding, suffocating light. And the roots, they began to retreat. Slowly at first, as if hesitant, and then, with increasing speed, as if the forest was retreating from something it feared. Eve fell to her knees beside him, eyes wide, her voice trembling. "Ryan, what did you do? What's happening?" The earth around them cracked open, the ancient energy of the forest fleeing, retreating into the cracks of the earth like some wounded animal. The air grew lighter, and the roots around them withdrew into the ground, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. The keeper, the spirit, screamed in fury, its form twisting and warping as it dissolved into the air, swallowed by the earth. And then, it was gone. The forest fell silent. Ryan collapsed onto the ground, his hands still pressed against the earth, his body trembling with exhaustion, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened, the energy of the forest still echoing in his veins. But it was quiet now. The forest was no longer alive in the same way. It was dormant. For now. "Is it over?" Eve asked softly, her voice full of awe and uncertainty. Ryan didn't answer. He didn't know if it was over. He didn't know if it could be over. But he knew one thing for certain. They had broken free of the forest's grip. For now. And that perhaps was enough. The silence that followed felt almost unnatural. The air, thick with the echo of the forest's former wrath, was now still, too still. Ryan's heart raced in his chest, the adrenaline still coursing through him. But now, a deep weariness had settled over him. He could still feel the pull of the forest, the faint, lingering echo of the malevolent spirit, but it was no longer as suffocating. The world had become quiet, almost too quiet. Eve crouched beside him, her fingers trembling as she touched his arm. She hadn't let go of him since the moment the ground had split apart. Her eyes were wide, filled with disbelief. "Ryan, did we do it? Is it really gone?" Ryan glanced at her, his lips dry. He didn't know how to answer. His instincts told him to be cautious, to never trust a silence like this. The forest had been unpredictable before. It had tricked them. What if it was still waiting for them to lower their guard? I don't know, he muttered, forcing himself to stand. His legs felt like they were made of lead, but he pushed through it, steadying himself. I think we stopped it, but I don't know if it's gone for good." Eve looked around, the fear in her eyes still evident, but she nodded slowly. "I know. I don't think either of us will ever really feel safe here again." Ryan rubbed his temples, trying to shake the exhaustion that clouded his mind. But even as he did, his eyes kept darting back to the place where the roots had risen, to the center of the monument where the dark power had once swirled. He couldn't stop thinking about the energy that had pulsed beneath the earth. That connection, that feeling, and that was when he saw it. At first, it was a faint shimmer, like the heat from a distant fire, but it quickly grew stronger, a wisp of black smoke, curling lazily from the cracks in the earth where the roots had once emerged. The smoke twisted, slowly rising into the air as if seeking something, a dark tendril reaching out to the sky. Ryan froze. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It can't be. It was supposed to be gone." Eve turned to follow his gaze. Her eyes widened when she saw the smoke, and her face went pale. "What the hell is that?" Ryan backed away, pulling her with him. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned, something unexpected happened. The earth beneath them trembled again, a low, mournful rumble, almost like a growl. The ground began to shift and crack, as if something below was stirring once more. And then the trees began to move. Not in the way they had before, not with the violent, terrifying animation of the forest's previous attack, but in a much more subtle way. The branches bent, twisting in unnatural angles. The leaves fluttered in the air, but there was no wind. The forest was waiting for them to make a mistake. The realization hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. The forest wasn't just alive in a physical sense. It was alive in a way that could never truly be killed. It wasn't just a place. It was an entity, a consciousness that had been bound beneath the surface for centuries. It knew them. It had known them from the very moment they had stepped into its domain. No, Ryan breathed again, his mind racing. This isn't over. It never was. Before Eve could speak, the smoke in the air thickened, swirling faster as it gathered into a dark cloud. It stretched and twisted, gaining form, taking shape. It was the Keeper, or at least a part of it. Its formless shadow expanded, its edges flickering like flames. But this time, it wasn't just an amalgamation of darkness and roots. No, this time, it was more tangible, more real. As it rose into the air, its eyes glowed once again, burning with a malevolent hunger. It was as though the Keeper had reformed, remade itself in a new, more powerful image. Ryan's heart pounded as he realized the truth. They hadn't destroyed it. They had only weakened it. The spirit of the forest had found a way to regenerate, to grow again, like the roots it was born from. The bond between the forest and the Keeper was so deep, so inextricable, that nothing they had done could truly sever it. Eve, Ryan gasped, turning to her. We need to get out of here. Now. This isn't over, not by a long shot. But Eve was already looking past him, eyes wide in horror. It's too late. Ryan whirled around, just in time to see the Keeper, no longer a twisting, dark shape, but now a towering figure, made of shifting, inky blackness and jagged tree roots, lurch toward them. Its voice, once a whisper, now rang out in a guttural roar. You cannot escape what is already yours. The roots around them erupted from the ground, twisting like serpents, blocking every path they could take. The trees leaned in, their gnarled branches closing around them like an iron cage. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The Keeper wasn't just hunting them, it was entangling them in its power, feeding off their fear, their desperation. No, please, Eve cried, backing up against Ryan, her hands shaking as she reached for him. Ryan could barely hear her through the rising panic, the overwhelming weight of the forest bearing down on them. He felt the roots tug. He could feel the forest calling to him, tugging at his very soul, trying to swallow him whole. The forest knew him. It knew his deepest fears, and it used them to torment him. We have to cut the connection, Ryan yelled, his mind scrambling for a solution, for something, anything that would work. Eve's eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded. How do we cut it off, Ryan? What do we do? Ryan scanned the environment, the dark spirit of the Keeper looming closer with every passing second, its roots creeping ever nearer. But then he saw it. The source of the Keeper's power, the monument. The ancient structure they had destroyed earlier. The monument had been the focal point, the point of binding that had kept the forest's malevolent force contained. But now it was broken. Ryan grabbed Eve's arm and pulled her in the direction of the monument, past the twisting, coiling roots. The monument! It was the key. We have to finish what we started. Eve's eyes widened, realization dawning. But how? It's in pieces, Ryan. Ryan didn't answer. He didn't have time. The Keeper was almost upon them. and if they didn't act fast, they would be consumed. He had to do something, anything, to sever this bond once and for all. In one desperate move, Ryan grabbed a jagged shard of stone from the broken monument, the remnants of the ancient structure now littering the ground. He raised the shard, his body shaking from fear and exhaustion, and prepared to strike the ground. His thoughts were chaotic, but a single truth rang clear in his mind. The forest couldn't win this time. With one final roar, Ryan slammed the stone into the ground. The moment Ryan's hand slammed the jagged shard of stone into the ground, a violent tremor shook the earth beneath them. The ground cracked open like a wound, jagged fissures spreading outward from the point of impact, sending splinters of stone and dirt flying into the air. The air was thick with the sound of groaning trees and crackling roots, the earth itself seeming to howl in agony. For a split second, everything went still. Then, the keeper's voice, once so confident and all-encompassing, split the silence. It was a screech of pure, raw rage, unlike anything Ryan had heard before. The shadowy form of the spirit recoiled, its features warping and twisting in agony, as if something inside it was fighting to survive. "You fool!" it screamed, its voice no longer a whisper in their minds, but a shrill, physical screech that filled the entire forest. "You think you can sever what is eternal? You think you can destroy me? I am a forest itself. You cannot." Ryan didn't wait to hear more. His heart pounded in his chest as the roots around him began to writhe, jerking and twisting in every direction, their speed and violence increasing exponentially. The forest wasn't just alive, it was fighting for its survival, clawing and reaching out in every direction to reclaim its power. "Run!" Ryan shouted to Eve, his voice raw with desperation. He grabbed her by the arm and yanked her forward, pulling her through the unstable, shaking ground. The forest had come alive again, but this time it wasn't as a single force. It was fracturing, splintering apart, a battle within itself, the keeper struggling to hold everything together. They didn't need to be told twice. Eve didn't question him, didn't hesitate. She ran alongside him, her eyes wild with terror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The roots snapped and hissed like serpents, reaching toward them, trying to drag them back into the soil. But each time they leapt out of the way, the roots recoiled as if burned by the breaking energy. Ryan's legs burned with exhaustion. His lungs screamed for air, but they kept running. There was no choice. The moment they neared the remnants of the monument, the shattered remains of the once imposing structure, Ryan stopped. Eve stumbled, nearly crashing into him, but he held her back, his eyes fixed on the chasm in the earth. The ground was still splitting. Dark smoke continued to rise from the cracks, but now it seemed to be fleeing, the force of its scattering, as though the monument itself had become a countermeasure, a prison that had once contained the keeper, now partially undone. If they could destroy it, completely sever it from the forest power, they might finally have a chance. "Eve, we have to destroy it," Ryan gasped, looking around at the jagged edges of stone and broken rock that surrounded them. "This is the only way. If we don't finish this now, it will come back again. Stronger." Eve's face was pale, but her jaw was set. She was trembling, but she nodded, her eyes determined. "I'm with you." Ryan grabbed another piece of broken stone, sharp, heavy, the remnants of the very monument that had once held the keeper's power in check, and turned toward the gaping chasm in the earth. Without hesitation, he swung the shard down into the crack. At first, nothing happened. Then, the earth shook with a force so violent it knocked both of them to their knees. The ground beneath them seemed to roar, and the dark, shadowy figure of the keeper shrieked in fury. Its form twisted again, but this time it was unraveling, crumbling like the broken pieces of the monument. "No!" The keeper's voice howled, distorted and desperate. "You think you can kill me? You think you can destroy me? I am a forest. I am the end of all things." Ryan didn't flinch. He raised the shard again, and this time He drove it even deeper into the crack, twisting it. The air around them thickened, and a heavy pressure built up, as though the forest was trying to compress all the life within it, all the pain and hunger that had been buried beneath the earth, into one single, suffocating moment. And then, with an explosion of light and sound, the ground split wide open. The keeper screamed, its form beginning to shudder violently, pieces of shadow falling away, dissolving into the air, consumed by the earth. The roots that had been slithering toward them froze, retreating in the face of the monument's shattering. Ryan's vision blurred with light as the force of the explosion pushed him backward, slamming him to the ground. The last thing he saw before the world went dark was the keeper, its form writhing, twisting into the air, only to disintegrate into nothingness, absorbed by the very earth that had given it life. When Ryan's eyes opened, everything was still. There was no sound, no movement, no pulse beneath the surface. Just an eerie, unnatural calm. He blinked several times, disoriented, and when he finally found the strength to sit up, he realized that the forest had changed. It wasn't the oppressive, living nightmare they had once escaped from. It was just forest, quiet, still, empty almost but alive in a way that felt natural. Eve was sitting beside him, looking equally shaken, but there was something different in her expression. She was looking at the sky, her eyes wide, taking in the peace that now surrounded them. Is it over? Ryan took a deep breath, still feeling the weight of the monument's power pressing on his chest. He wasn't sure, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could breathe. "I think it is," he said quietly. The forest was still. The ground beneath them no longer seemed to pulse with dark energy. It wasn't gone, not fully. It would never truly be gone. But for now it was quiet. It was at rest. As Ryan stood, he felt the weight of everything they had endured. The fear, the terror, the horror of being part of something so ancient and so unforgiving. But there was also something else, a sense of finality. They had done it. They had faced down the darkness, and they had won. For now, Eve stood beside him, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think it will ever come back?" Ryan hesitated, looking out at the forest, the silence wrapping around them like a blanket. There was no answer, not one he could give with certainty. But as he stared at the trees, the dark power now absent from the air, he finally spoke. "Maybe, but we won't be here when it does." Eve looked at him with a half smile, a tired, knowing expression. "No, we won't." And together, they walked away from the monument, from the forest, from the nightmare that had consumed them. They walked into the unknown, but this time, they did so with the knowledge that they had survived. For now, at least. For now, the forest was quiet. The air outside the forest was different. The dense, damp humidity that had clung to the trees and the earth had faded, leaving behind a cool, crisp breeze. It smelled fresh, almost too clean, as if the forest had exhaled a final, cleansing breath before releasing its hold on the world. As they walked, Ryan's thoughts were scattered. Part of him was still reeling from the violence of what they'd just endured, the monumental struggle against the keeper, the earth shaking beneath their feet, the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on them. But another part of him, perhaps a more dangerous part, kept wondering, is it really over? Eve didn't speak for a long time. She kept her eyes forward, her face pale but calm. She was still processing, just like him. He could tell from the way her jaw was set, the way her steps were hesitant, like she was bracing herself for something to jump out at her from the woods at any moment. "You okay?" Ryan asked, his voice quiet. Eve glanced at him, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, just. It doesn't feel real, you know? Like we did all that, and now. It's like it's never even happened." Ryan nodded slowly, the same thought weighing on his own chest. The forest behind them seemed almost unreal now, like a nightmare from which they'd just awoken. But that wasn't the case, was it? They had lived through it, survived it. They hadn't just imagined the terror, the dark whispers, the way the earth had moved beneath their feet. It had been real. And yet, the silence felt too perfect, too unnatural. I can't shake the feeling that something's still out there, Ryan admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. Eve glanced at him, her expression guarded. I know, it feels like the calm before the storm. But what if we're wrong? What if we really did stop it? What if there's nothing left? Ryan shook his head, his eyes narrowing. I don't know. Something about this. It feels like we only broke part of it. The Keeper's not the only thing tied to this forest. It's deeper than that. Something older. They fell into a heavy silence as the trees thinned behind them, the path now leading them down into a familiar clearing. Ryan could see the edge of the village in the distance, the first signs of civilization after what felt like an eternity in the forest. But the moment they crossed into the clearing, Ryan's breath caught in his throat. There at the edge of the path stood a figure. A person. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. For a second, he thought it was someone they knew, someone from their past, someone who had come to find them. But as they drew closer, the figure's features came into sharper focus, and a chill spread through Ryan's body. The person standing before them was draped in ragged, tattered clothes, their face obscured by shadows, their movements unnaturally still. And yet, there was something deeply wrong about them. Something familiar. It was as if the air around the figure itself rippled, the same energy that had once been tied to the forest, now swirling around them. Ryan froze, his instincts screaming at him to back away. Eve, do you see that? Eve had already stopped, her face draining of color as she stared at the figure. I don't know what I'm looking at. That's not a person. Is it? Before Ryan could respond, the figure took a step forward, and with it, a strange force washed over the clearing, an unsettling, cold presence, like the lingering remnants of a keeper, or something worse. The figure raised its hand slowly, and Ryan's heart skipped. As it did, the ground beneath them began to tremble again, this time with a much gentler vibration, almost like a beckoning hum. No, Ryan said, stepping back instinctively, pulling Eve with him. This can't be. It's impossible. Eve's voice trembled. Ryan, what is that? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, and the shadows that obscured its face shifted. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure's lips parted in a slow, deliberate motion, and a voice, soft but laden with an ancient sorrow, spoke. It never ends. The forest's hunger is endless. You cannot outrun it. You cannot escape it. You will always return. Ryan's stomach churned as the words sunk in. The forest. Hunger. The Keeper's words echoed in his mind. The connection had never been fully severed. They had only stopped it for now, only driven it back. But the forest's desire to consume, its need, was more than just a singular, malevolent spirit. It was something that lived within the land itself, something tied to its very bones. The Keeper had been just one vessel, and now, the forest had found another. No, Ryan whispered, his voice hoarse. No, it can't be. We ended it. We. The figure's head tilted again, and the shadows wrapped around its face, turning into a grotesque, gaping maw. The air seemed to thicken as the figure stepped forward, its presence crushing in on them, pulling the earth toward it, feeding off their fear. You didn't end it. It crooned, the voice now dripping with malice. You can never end what is already part of you. The last thing Ryan saw before the world around them distorted into an unrecognizable blur was the figure's eyes, two black voids, pools of absolute darkness that reflected only his own terrified face. Ryan blinked, suddenly back in a clearing, gasping for air. His heart raced as he looked around. Everything was still. The air was clean. The forest was silent. But there was a lingering sense of dread that hadn't been there before. He glanced at Eve, who was standing next to him, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. Eve nodded slowly, her lips trembling. I don't know, but I felt it. I felt the darkness again. Ryan swallowed, trying to steady himself. He had hoped, in that fleeting moment before the figure appeared, that they had escaped, that the terror they'd faced in the forest was behind them. But now he knew better. The forest wasn't done with them. Not yet. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowed figure standing behind them. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, still clearing and the path leading back toward the village. For a moment, it seemed like everything had returned to normal. But Ryan knew the truth now. They hadn't escaped. They just left the forest behind for now. As Ryan and Eve stood there, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them, a strange calm washed over the clearing. The woods no longer seemed alive with ominous energy, and yet the unease that lingered in their bones refused to leave. Eve was the first to break the silence. "Ryan, what was that? That thing? Was it the keeper?" Her voice trembled, and Ryan could hear the edge of fear creeping back into it. Ryan shook his head slowly, his mind racing. No, it wasn't the keeper. His voice was hoarse, still fighting against the cold dread that clung to him. It felt different, like it was part of the forest, but not exactly the keeper. That thing was tied to the land itself, like it was an extension of whatever's still alive in this place. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear his head, but the images of the shadowy figure, its black voids for eyes, were burned into his memory. He could still feel the presence of its voice, like something slithering into his thoughts, pressing into the space where his own mind should have been. It said we can never escape it, Eve said softly, as if speaking the words aloud somehow made them even more real. Ryan didn't answer right away. He could feel the truth in those words. It wasn't over. The forest had found a way to survive, even without the keeper. The spirit of the land, its hunger, it was all still there. I thought if we broke the monument, if we severed the keeper's control over the forest, it would stop, Ryan muttered, more to himself than to Eve. His fingers clenched into fists. But it didn't. It's like the forest is alive, like a disease that can never be fully eradicated. Eve swallowed hard, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. So what do we do now? What can we do? Ryan took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. He didn't know. He didn't have the answers. Not anymore. All he knew was that the forest wasn't done with them, and it wouldn't stop until it had consumed everything. But as the thought crossed his mind, another, more terrifying idea surfaced. What if it's not just here? He said quietly. What if this, whatever it is, it's connected to other places? What if it's not just this one forest, but something bigger, something wider? Eve stared at him for a long moment, and then her eyes widened. You mean, it's spreading? Ryan's stomach twisted. I don't know, but think about it. The keeper, it wasn't just a single entity. It was part of the land, part of everything. Maybe breaking the monument didn't sever its roots. Maybe it just weakened it. If it can survive here, it could survive anywhere. They both fell silent as the implications of Ryan's words sank in. How do we stop it? Eve asked, her voice breaking. How do we stop something like that? Ryan didn't have an answer. For a long moment, they both stood there, the vast emptiness of the clearing stretching out before them, the village still a distant speck on the horizon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows, and the world felt wrong. It was like the calm before a storm that they both knew was coming. I think, Ryan said slowly, we need to find out more. There's something we're missing, something we don't know about the forest, something older. Eve looked at him, her expression resigned, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. What are you saying? Ryan hesitated for a moment before answering, knowing that this was a path they might not be able to come back from. We go back to the source, the place where it all began. We need to go deeper into the forest, to the heart of it. Eve stared at him, and for a long moment, it was as if she was weighing the possibility, trying to gauge whether this was madness or the only choice they had. Finally, she nodded. All right, let's do it. But if we're going back there, we need to know exactly what we're up against. We can't make the same mistake twice. Ryan nodded in agreement. relief flooding through him as they finally made the decision together. Whatever this thing was, wherever it came from, they would face it. They had no choice. They turned back toward the woods, the path stretching ahead of them, darker now, almost like a shadow pulling them back. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, and it seemed as though the forest was waiting for them to return. Its whispers beckoned like an old, familiar song, as though it knew they had to come back, as though it was drawing them in. It wasn't just the forest anymore. It was the land itself, the bones of the earth, and if they didn't act soon, if they didn't end it, it would consume everything. The moon hung low in the sky as they approached the tree line. The once peaceful forest now loomed like a dark abyss, its branches twisting and groaning in the wind. "I don't feel right about this," Eve whispered, her voice tight. "We don't know what's waiting for us in there." Ryan glanced over at her, his gaze hardening with resolve. "I know, but we can't let whatever is spread. If it's tied to the land, we have to find a way to stop it. The keeper wasn't the source. It was just one piece of the puzzle." Eve nodded, her breath shallow as she stepped forward, the undergrowth crunching under her boots. "Then let's find the rest of the pieces." They stepped into the forest, the darkness closing around them once more. The trees seemed to move and shift in ways that weren't natural, like they were alive, like they were aware of their every step. The path that had once seemed so clear now felt like a maze, twisting and turning, each step leading them deeper into the heart of the woods. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The forest no longer seemed full of life. It felt hollow, like an empty shell waiting to be filled again. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. Then they came to a clearing, one they hadn't seen before, a place that felt ancient. The trees here were massive, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their roots clawing at the earth as if trying to pull something up from deep within. At the center of the clearing was a large stone structure, ancient and weathered, covered in moss and vine. It was a monument, just like the one they had destroyed, but this one was different. It was older. Its markings were strange, unfamiliar, and as Ryan stepped closer, he felt a sudden chill creep up his spine. "This is it," he whispered. "This is where it all started." Eve stood frozen beside him, her eyes wide with fear. "Ryan, what if this is worse than we thought? What if we're too late?" Ryan didn't respond at first. He couldn't. All he could do was stare at the monument, its dark power pulsing faintly, like the heartbeat of the land itself. They had come here to end it, but now it seemed they were standing at the edge of something even darker. Ryan stood motionless as he stared at the monument, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The air had thickened around them, a pressure settling in the clearing like a heavy, suffocating weight. The stone structure loomed over them, ancient and imposing, its jagged edges like the teeth of some forgotten creature, waiting for them to step closer. "Do you feel that?" Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible against the oppressive silence. Eve nodded slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide with unease. "Yeah, it's like the air is alive here. It's wrong." Ryan reached out with a trembling hand, hovering just above the monument surface. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the air around it pulsed with a low hum that resonated deep in his chest. He could feel it. This thing, whatever it was connected to the forest in ways that words could not fully explain. It wasn't just a physical structure. It was a node, a place of deep power, perhaps even older than the keeper itself. Eve shifted beside him, eyes scanning the monument as if trying to find some sign of what had drawn them here. "Ryan, we don't know what this is. We can't just touch it. What if it's worse than anything we've already faced?" Ryan clenched his fists. He knew she was right. They didn't know what they were dealing with here. But in the back of his mind, something told him that this was the key. If they could understand what this monument was, they might finally have a chance to stop whatever darkness was still bleeding out of the forest. "I don't think we have a choice," he said, his voice low but firm. Whatever this is, it's tied to everything we've been through. And if we're going to stop it, we need to understand it. Eve hesitated, her gaze flickering back to the monument. She swallowed, her fear evident, but also a quiet resolve settling in. All right, but we stick together, no matter what happens. Ryan nodded, his pulse quickening. Together, they approached the monument, the air thickening around them with every step. As they neared its base, the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse as well, slow, rhythmic, like the heart of the earth itself was beating beneath the stone. "Look," Eve said, pointing to the markings etched deep into the stone. They were intricate and complex, more like symbols than words, but there was one thing that was undeniable. They seemed to shift. The longer Ryan stared, the more the symbols appeared to move, changing forms in a way that made his head spin. "They're not static," he muttered, taking a step closer. "They're alive." Eve stepped forward with him, her eyes squinting as she tried to decipher the shapes. Maybe they're a warning, or a map. What if this monument is connected to the forest power, like a lock? And the keeper was the key. Ryan wasn't sure he understood, but the theory seemed plausible. He placed a hand on one of the symbols, and the instant he did, the hum of the monument grew louder, vibrating through his fingertips and up his arm. It felt like the entire forest held its breath. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, the monument reacted. A deep rumble echoed through the ground, and the sky overhead darkened, as if clouds were suddenly drawn toward the clearing. A cold wind whipped around them, and the trees shuddered violently, their branches creaking as if the forest itself was awakening. Ryan jerked his hand away from the monument, heart racing. What the hell is happening? Eve stumbled back, eyes wide with fear. It's reacting to us. We shouldn't have. But before she could finish, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and a crack, loud, sharp, split the air. The monument seemed to shudder with life, and a low, otherworldly growl rumbled from deep within the earth, echoing through the trees. Ryan and Eve both froze. In the midst of the chaos, something else appeared, a shadow at the edge of the clearing, its form dark and formless against the deepening twilight. "It's not just the monument," Ryan breathed. "It's the forest, the heart of the forest." The shadow began to shift, its shape flickering like smoke in the wind. Slowly, it coalesced into something more solid, a figure. A figure Ryan recognized, the twisted form it now took. The Keeper, but not in the same way they had seen it before. This version of the Keeper was no longer confined to the human-like body they had fought earlier. Its limbs were stretched and warped, as if the forest itself had consumed and reformed it, reshaping it into a grotesque parody of life. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was now a mass of gnarled roots and tangled vines, its eyes two hollow voids that seemed to reach directly into their souls. "You failed." The Keeper's voice was a rasping, disembodied whisper, echoing around them from every direction. "But the forest will never fail." Ryan stepped back, his mind racing. "What do you want from us?" The Keeper's form shifted again, and a tendril of dark energy lashed out from the monument, wrapping itself around Ryan's wrist. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as the energy pulsed through him, freezing him in place. "You can never escape," the Keeper rasped, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You've come to the source, but you have not come to end it." The shadowed form of the Keeper flickered again, twisting and curling like a nightmare. "You are too late. The hunger of the forest is not just a creature, a spirit, a curse. It is life itself. You cannot sever it. You cannot destroy what is already within you." Ryan gritted his teeth, trying to pull free of the tendril, but it held fast, its grip tightening. The air around them grew colder, the trees groaning in agony as the forest seemed to pulse, as though feeding off the Keeper's twisted form. And yet, in the distance, Ryan could see something else, a flicker of light, a break in the overwhelming darkness. "Eve," Ryan shouted, struggling harder against the grip. "We have to do something." Eve was already moving, her face set with grim determination. "We don't have a choice. We fight back." With that, she reached into her bag and pulled out the shard of the broken monument, the piece they had kept as a last-ditch hope, a weapon against the forest's power. She raised it high, and the moment she did, the ground trembled violently. A sharp, piercing light erupted from the shard, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The keeper screeched, its form distorting as if it was being torn apart from the inside. But it wasn't over yet. Ryan could feel it. Whatever the shard was doing, it was weakening the keeper, but it wasn't enough. Ryan's eyes locked with Eve's. The battle had just begun. The light from the shard grew brighter, and Ryan felt an electric jolt of energy pulse through his body, reverberating through the tendril wrapped around his wrist. The keeper's screech grew, more frantic, its form warping and twisting as though it were struggling to hold itself together under the intensity of the light. Eve gritted her teeth, holding the shard aloft. It's working," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and exhilaration. "But we need to push harder. We have to force it back." Ryan's mind raced as he tried to wrench his arm free of the dark tendril that held him. Each movement seemed to make the shadow of the keeper grow more distorted, the ancient power that filled the forest coiling and shifting like a living thing. "You can't defeat me," the keeper rasped, its voice like 100 whispering voices all at once, echoing in their ears. "I am the forest. I am the land. You cannot destroy what is alive." But Ryan didn't listen. His focus was locked on the monument, the shard, and Eve's desperate struggle to hold the light steady. He knew they had to keep pushing. If they could weaken the keeper enough, they might just have a chance to end it once and for all. With a surge of strength, Ryan yanked his arm, his heart pounding as the tendril snapped, releasing him with a sickening, echoing crack. He stumbled back, gasping for breath, his vision blurring from the force of the energy he'd just withstood. But there was no time to rest. He was already charging forward, and he followed suit, keeping his eyes on the keeper. The shadow of the keeper twisted and expanded, the vines and roots of the forest itself appearing to grow from its body, reaching out like claws. It seemed to multiply, 1,000 tendrils of darkness crawling from the ground, creeping along the trees, and stretching out toward them with unnatural speed. Ryan could feel the pressure building, the ground beneath his feet trembling with each movement. He had to act quickly. If the keeper was allowed to expand any further, they would be completely overwhelmed. "Eve, get back!" Ryan shouted, his voice hoarse from the strain. Eve didn't hesitate. With the shard still glowing fiercely in her hands, she pulled back, positioning herself at Ryan's side. "What's the plan?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously to the keeper's growing form. "We push it into the monument," Ryan said through clenched teeth. "We have to use the shard to force the keeper back into the source. If we can get it back inside the stone, maybe we can trap it there for good." Eve's eyes widened in realization. The source. The monument is the prison. "Exactly," Ryan said, tightening his grip on his weapon. He glanced around for any sign of weakness in the keeper's form. "We force it back into the stone, and maybe the forest will die with it. We have to end this, once and for all." Without another word, they advanced. The keeper screeched again, its twisted form expanding into the air like a grotesque storm cloud, filling the clearing with an overwhelming sense of dread. It didn't seem like it was just a creature anymore. It had become a force of nature, something beyond comprehension, something that was the forest, something they couldn't fully grasp. The darkness twisted, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire world had plunged into an abyss. But Ryan had made his decision. His hand tightened around the shard, its pulse matching the frantic beat of his heart. He had no other choice but to face it head-on. Together, they pushed forward. The keeper lashed out, tendrils of shadow darting toward them with blinding speed. Ryan swung his arm, using the shard to cut through the air, the light growing brighter and brighter with every movement. Each strike pushed the dark form back, but not enough. The keeper was stronger than they had anticipated. The forest itself seemed to fight alongside it, shifting and changing, wrapping them in its web of darkness. Eve gasped, her breath shallow, as one of the tendrils struck her arm, sending a jolt of freezing pain through her body. She stumbled, but kept her footing, her eyes narrowing in defiance. Not this time, she spat, raising the shard higher. With a growl, Ryan lunged forward, focusing everything he had left on the glowing shard. It cut through the air with an almost primal force, and this time, the keeper shrieked, its scream tearing through the clearing with an intensity that shook the ground beneath their feet. The darkness recoiled, its form faltering for the first time since they had arrived. "It's working," Ryan shouted, voice filled with adrenaline. But the keeper wasn't done. The shadowed form flared with even greater intensity, coiling up like a massive serpent, its vines stretching and splitting like a spider's web across the sky. The trees around them began to shake violently, their roots clawing through the earth as the forest fought back. Ryan's chest tightened with a sudden realization. The keeper wasn't alone. This wasn't just one entity. They were facing the manifestation of the forest soul. The land itself had grown sentient, had grown hungry, and it was ready to devour anything that stood in its way. "You will be consumed," the keeper's voice whispered, low and insidious. It was everywhere, in the trees, in the wind, in their minds. You cannot stop the hunger. It has always been here. It is part of this place. Ryan's vision blurred as the shadows closed in, and for a moment, he thought they might lose. But just then, Eve shouted, her voice strong and filled with determination. "Ryan, we can't let it win. We are the light. We are the force that can break it." The words hit him like a surge of clarity, and with a final burst of will, Ryan held the shard high, feeling its power course through him. The light shot out, brighter than ever, crackling with raw energy. The keeper screeched again, its form cracking, fracturing as if it were being torn apart. Ryan and Eve didn't look back. They pressed forward until the keeper was nothing more than a blinding, shattered mass of darkness, flickering like a dying flame. With a final explosion of light, the keeper shrieked and vanished into the monument. The air went still. For a long moment, everything was silent. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just the faintest hum in the distance, as if the earth itself was breathing. Ryan and Eve stood there, both panting, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. The shard in Eve's hand had dimmed, its glow fading to nothing. The forest was still, but as they turned to leave the clearing, a single leaf, blackened and shriveled, drifted from the trees above them. And as it fell, a whisper rode on the wind, barely audible, but unmistakable. "You can never escape me." Ryan's heart skipped a beat at the whisper. The words weren't just in the air, they were in his mind, crawling beneath his skin, leaving a cold, bitter feeling behind. The leaf fluttered down in slow motion, as if it were floating toward them in a dance, before landing softly at their feet. The forest was still, deadly still. Ryan crouched down slowly, his breath shallow, and he stared at the leaf. It was dark, withered, unlike anything he'd seen in the forest before. But it was the words, the whisper, that gnawed at him. "You can never escape me." What the hell was that? Eve's voice broke through his thoughts, tight with unease. Ryan stood slowly, looking around the clearing. The monument loomed behind them, silent now. But the chill in the air hadn't subsided. It felt like the forest was waiting, like the trees were listening, their ancient eyes seeing more than just their physical form. "I don't know," Ryan muttered, rubbing his temples, trying to shake the feeling of something lingering just out of sight. The monument was supposed to be the end of it, wasn't it? The keeper had been destroyed. The forest had to be neutralized, but now it didn't feel like it. It felt like they had only made things worse. "We need to get out of here," Eve said, her voice trembling with fear that she couldn't quite hide. Before whatever that was comes back. It's not over, is it? Ryan met her gaze, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what to say. He wanted to believe they had won. They fought back, they destroyed the keeper, but that whisper still lingered in his mind, threading itself through his thoughts. The forest was silent, yes, but only for now. You're right, he said finally. Let's get out. The others need to know what happened here. Eve didn't protest, but she hesitated, her eyes lingering on the monument. Do you think we did the right thing? Trapping it in there? Was that the right choice? Ryan took one last glance at the stone structure, the source of it all. A shudder ran through him. They had done what they thought was best, but now it was clear they had no idea what they had truly unleashed. I don't know, he muttered, but we can't undo it. Let's go. We'll figure out later. Together, they turned, walking back toward the dense woods. Each step felt heavier, like the very air was pressing down on them. The trees towered above them, casting long shadows, and the path out seemed longer than before. The oppressive silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of their footsteps. But as they walked, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The whispers were back, faint at first, like a breeze moving through the branches. Then louder. The air thickened with every passing moment. The rustling leaves seemed to whisper their names, calling out to them. He turned sharply, scanning the forest behind them. Eve, did you hear that? Eve looked around, her expression panicked. What? What is it? Before Ryan could respond, the forest erupted with movement. The trees shifted, and the ground seemed to pulse beneath their feet. From the corners of his vision, figures moved, shadows darting between the trunks, creeping closer with every heartbeat. Ryan felt a cold, creeping dread settle into his bones. The forest was alive. Too alive. Something was wrong. A low rumble echoed from deep within the woods, and the earth trembled beneath their feet. Ryan's stomach turned. They had seen the forest's power, but this was something new, something darker, and it was growing stronger. Eve grabbed his arm, her grip tight with panic. We need to go. Now. Ryan didn't argue. They ran. They darted through the trees, the path now distorted, twisting and contorting as if the forest itself was reshaping to trap them. The air grew thick, suffocating, and each step they took felt like wading through molasses. Shadows stretched long across the ground, but there was something off about them, something unnatural about the way they moved, like the forest was watching them, studying their every move. Suddenly, Ryan stumbled. His foot caught on something hidden in the underbrush. He fell forward, his hands hitting the ground hard. Ryan, Eve screamed, but when he looked up, it wasn't her voice he heard. It was something else. The whisper was back, only now it was louder, clearer, filling his head with an unholy chorus of voices. You cannot escape. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest as a cold, paralyzing fear washed over him. The air was alive with the whispers. The trees creaked and groaned, bending toward them like they were alive. The forest was closing in. Ryan, get up. Eve's voice snapped him out of his panic. She was already on her feet, pulling him toward her. They didn't have time to think. They ran faster, the forest closing in around them with every step. And then they saw it. The clearing ahead, the edge of the forest. But there was something there, standing in the center of it. The monument. It was there again. Ryan stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught in his throat as his mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The clearing had been miles behind them. How could it be here? Eve's eyes went wide with terror. It's not possible, she whispered, almost in disbelief. It can't be here. The voice interrupted her. It was loud now, unmistakable. The keeper's voice. You can never leave. Not now. Not after awakening me. The monument began to crack, the stone splitting wide open, and from it, something began to emerge. A mass of twisted vines and roots, writhing and wriggling, as if the monument itself were giving birth to something monstrous. Ryan and Eve stared in horror as the form began to take shape. The keeper had returned, but this time it was more than a creature. It was an embodiment of the forest itself. Something more ancient, more powerful, and it was coming for them. The ground beneath Ryan and Eve trembled violently as the monument cracked further. The air seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. The twisted vines and roots that emerged from the stone writhed like serpents, moving in rhythmic, horrifying patterns as though they were alive. No, they were alive. Ryan's heart hammered in his chest. His mind raced as he watched the horrifying mass of darkness and nature intertwine, growing more solid with every passing second. The keeper wasn't just a manifestation of the forest anymore. It was the forest, and it was coming for them. "We can't fight it like this," Eve gasped, her eyes wide with fear. This is bigger than anything we've faced. We have to get out now." Ryan glanced around desperately, but the trees seemed to stretch further into the distance, closing them in. The path they had taken was gone, swallowed by the dark mass. There was no escape. The keeper was already too close. He heard the voice again, louder, stronger, reverberating in the pit of his stomach. "You cannot escape. I am the forest. You are nothing." The words sent a cold shiver down his spine. The keeper's form was now fully manifest, standing tall and imposing, a mass of tangled roots and writhing vines, with eyes that glowed, like the heart of a fire. It wasn't just a creature anymore. It was an ancient force, a sentient being tied to the land, the forest's consciousness made flesh. Ryan's breath hitched. There was no running. There was no fighting. The keeper was beyond any weapon they had, any plan they could conceive. Eve's voice shook with desperation. "Ryan, we can't just stand here." But Ryan wasn't looking at the keeper anymore. His gaze was locked on something else, the shard. The piece of the monument that had guided them this far. It was still in Eve's hand, glowing dimly, almost like it was waiting. Like it knew they needed it. They needed it. Without thinking, he grabbed Eve's arm, his grip fierce. "Give me the shard." She looked at him, her face pale, but didn't hesitate. She handed it to him, her fingers trembling. "Ryan, I think I know what to do," he said, his voice steady despite the terror tightening around his chest. "We've been fighting the keeper with our strength, but we've been doing it all wrong. It's not about defeating it with force. It's about understanding it. It's part of the forest. The forest is it." Eve's expression was a mix of confusion and dread, but she didn't argue. She simply stepped back, watching him closely as he raised the shard. He closed his eyes, his mind focused on the ancient energy that seemed to hum from the monument's broken shard. It wasn't just power, it was something more. Something primal. The essence of the forest was in it, alive in every crack and fissure of the stone. Ryan felt it deep within him, vibrating with an unnatural force. "The shard," he whispered, almost to himself. "It's a part of the keeper. It's part of the forest's power. If we can control it, maybe we can break the connection, make it stop. We have to use it to unbind it." Eve's eyes widened as she realized what he was suggesting. "Ryan, you're talking about destroying the bond. The forest bond. That could..." "I know." Ryan cut her off. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't, the keeper will consume everything. It's already too late for the forest itself." With that, he pressed the shard to his chest, feeling the power course through him like lightning. It burned, the energy sharp and wild, but he held on, gritting his teeth through the pain. The keeper screeched, its tendrils of dark vines snapping toward him with terrifying speed, but Ryan focused harder. Feel the pulse of the earth, he told himself. Feel the heartbeat of the forest. This is part of it, but I'm not it. I'm not the forest. He imagined the energy surging out of him, flowing through the shard, into the heart of the keeper, severing the threads that bound it to the land. The keeper shrieked, the vines twisting and thrashing as though it were being torn apart from the inside. The very ground around them began to crack, the earth splitting wide as the power of Shard reached deep into the roots of the forest, unbinding the dark magic. The keeper's form shrank back, writhing in agony. It wasn't just retreating, it was breaking apart, its shape distorting, the ancient force unraveling like a frayed rope. Ryan's chest tightened, the strain of holding the energy back growing unbearable. "Eve, help me," he gasped, his voice raw in effort. Eve didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, placing her hands on the shard, and together, they pushed the light forward, amplifying the energy. The keeper let out one final, bone-chilling scream that seemed to shake the very air around them. And then, nothing. The forest was silent. Ryan stood there, gasping for air, his body trembling from the strain. The shard, now dim and lifeless in his hands, slipped from his grip and fell to the ground with a soft thud. He looked around slowly, his heart still racing. The keeper was gone. The darkness that had consumed the forest was gone. The trees, though still eerily silent, were no longer alive with that unnatural energy. The path was clear, but as the dust settled, the dread in Ryan's heart remained. Something wasn't right. The forest was still there. The land still breathed, but there was a quiet hunger beneath the surface. We did it," Eve said quietly, her voice trembling with relief. "It's over." Ryan turned to face her, shaking his head. "I don't know if it's truly over. It feels like something's still here. Something watching us." Eve frowned, glancing around. The trees stood tall, their branches still as statues, casting long shadows across the clearing. For a moment, it felt like they were safe. But Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that the forest still had one last card to play. A whisper floated on the wind, so faint it was almost imperceptible. "You cannot escape me. Not now. Not ever." Ryan froze. Eve turned toward him, eyes wide. He swallowed hard. They hadn't just defeated the keeper. They had unleashed something else. The forest was still alive, and now it was watching. The wind picked up, howling through the trees with an eerie intensity. The whisper was louder now, swirling around them, bending the branches of the trees as if they were reaching toward them. The shadows that had once been static were now moving, slithering across the forest floor like snakes, coiling and unraveling in a slow, deliberate dance. Ryan's heart pounded, his pulse quickening as the familiar sense of dread began to creep back into his bones. His thoughts were racing. They had destroyed the keeper, or so they thought. They had freed the forest from its dark grasp. But what if the keeper was only a part of something much larger? What if it had been the manifestation of a deeper, older presence, something that wasn't so easily destroyed? He turned to Eve, whose face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Eve, but she was already looking around, her body tense, her breath shallow. "Ryan, Before she could finish, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble again, more violently than before. The trees groaned, their massive trunks bending unnaturally as though they were being pulled towards something unseen. The earth cracked wide open, fissures snaking through the ground like a living thing. Ryan stumbled backward, his body crashing into Eve as she instinctively grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the spreading cracks. They both looked up, and in that moment they saw it. The monument, now shattered, began to glow with a sickly green light. The jagged edges of the stone twisted and pulsed, as if the monument itself was alive. From the cracks in the stone, thick, black roots began to emerge, reaching out like claws, burrowing into the earth. The roots seemed to be growing, expanding at an unnatural rate, spreading through the ground like veins pumping dark, corrupted blood through the forest. "Ryan, what's happening?" Eve's voice cracked, her grip tightening on his arm. Ryan's mind raced, but the answer was too terrible to comprehend. The forest wasn't free. The keeper had only been a single aspect of something far more ancient and terrifying. The monument had been its prison, and now that it had been broken, the true nature of the forest was beginning to unravel. And then the air grew heavy, thick with the stench of decay and rot. The trees began to move, not like wind through the leaves, but as though they were sentient beings bending toward them, their bark stretching and cracking. Their roots shot from the ground like massive tendrils, blocking any way out of the clearing. The forest was closing in on them, and it wasn't just the keeper anymore. The forest itself had awakened. No, we can't, Ryan gasped, trying to force himself to think. What do we do now? He had no weapon left, no shield, no defense against the forest itself. Eve's voice broke through the chaos. Ryan, we have to stop this. If the keeper wasn't the true power, then what is? Ryan turned to her, eyes wide with realization. The forest itself. It was the keeper's prison, its cage. The keeper wasn't just a guardian. It was the keeper of the balance. And when we destroyed it, we disrupted everything. The forest was contained, but now it's free. His words were lost in the sudden screeching sound that filled the air, a screech so loud, so agonizing, that it shook the ground beneath them. The very air seemed to crack with the sound as a massive shadow rose from the monument. Ryan's stomach turned as the shape took form. It wasn't just the keeper anymore, it was something worse. The darkness seemed to take the shape of a colossal, twisting mass, like a monstrous version of the forest itself. The vines that had been mere tendrils before now expanded into massive, roiling masses of roots and bark, moving like serpents, with eyes appearing in the knotted wood and mouths made of gaping holes filled with darkness. The massive form loomed over them, its voice rising like a storm in their minds, not just a whisper now, but a roar of pure hunger. You think you have broken me? You think you can stop what was always inevitable? Ryan's mind screamed. The forest was alive. It was sentient, conscious, and now, with the keeper destroyed, it had become the beast it was always meant to be. The keeper had been its warden, its guide, its keeper. But now it was free. Free to do whatever it wanted. We can't stop this, Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening sound of the forest's voice. It's too big. We're too small. The forest is everything. It is life and death in this place. Eve's hand clenched into a fist. But we can stop it. If it's truly sentient, then it must have a heart, a source. We just need to find it. Where? Ryan asked, his voice broken. He was too far gone in his panic to think clearly. The earth beneath them began to split wide open. Something was rising from below. Something ancient. Something that had been buried beneath the surface for centuries. Behind you, Eve shouted. Ryan turned just in time to see a massive root shoot toward him, its tip sharpened like a spear. With no time to react, Ryan instinctively swung his arm up in defense, and the root collided with him, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through his body, and for a moment, his vision blurred. But in that moment of chaos, he saw it, the faintest flicker of light in the distance. Not from the forest, not from a monstrous shape looming over them, but from the edge. The very edge of the forest, where the last light of the setting sun hit the ground. A small, faint light, like a beacon of hope. Eve, look! Ryan gasped, his voice strained. Eve turned, following his gaze. What is it? What's that light? It's a way out, Ryan said, though he wasn't sure he was right. But at this point, it was all they had. They didn't have time to fight the forest head-on. They needed to find its core, its source, and they needed to do it quickly before the forest devoured them entirely. We have to go. Now. Without waiting for her response. He grabbed her hand and ran, his legs burning from the effort, but there was no time for hesitation. The earth around them continued to crack, the trees bending and reaching for them, but the light was getting closer. Behind them, the massive shadow of the forest shifted, and the keeper's voice returned, colder and more vengeful than before. "You cannot escape me." And then, a dark laugh echoed through the land, deep and low. The forest's hunger had only just begun. Ryan's legs burned as he and Eve sprinted through the forest, the earth beneath them splitting and shifting, threatening to swallow them whole. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the sky above had darkened, heavy clouds swirling ominously as if the very heavens were responding to the forest's rage. They didn't dare look back, but Ryan could feel the presence of the forest growing stronger, the dark tendrils of roots reaching for them, scraping across the ground with sickening speed. The keeper's laughter, low, rumbling, and filled with malice, echoed through the trees, reverberating in their very bones. It wasn't just a creature anymore. It was an entire world, alive and awake, and it wanted them. Ryan's breath came in ragged gasps, but he couldn't slow down. There was no time to rest. The light ahead, the faint beacon of hope, was their only chance. It was their only escape. "Eve," Ryan called out, glancing over his shoulder for a brief moment. "Keep running." Almost there. Eve didn't need any encouragement. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she was running with a determination that matched his own. Her footfalls were quick, but the ground beneath them seemed to change with every step, shifting like the forest itself was trying to stop them. The light, distant at first, was now closer, much closer. It flickered in the distance like a dying star, but the closer they got, the more Ryan felt a sense of unease. The forest wasn't just giving up. It was pushing them toward that light, like a predator herding its prey. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet gave way, and Ryan's heart leapt into his throat as he stumbled, barely managing to catch himself before plunging into the growing fissure. Eve collided with him, and they both tumbled to the ground. Before Ryan could react, the earth around them groaned, and the forest seemed to swell, the branches twisting toward them like giant claws. Roots shot up from the ground, wrapping around their ankles, pulling them toward the dark depths of the earth. "Ryan," Eve screamed, fighting against the roots that coiled around her legs. "Help me." Ryan's heart raced as the roots tightened, dragging them both toward the earth's gaping mouth. His mind scrambled for a solution, but there was no time. The forest was winning. It was devouring them. The light. He had to get to the light. "No," he grunted, forcing himself to pull free of the roots. His fingers scraped against the soil, but he finally managed to free one leg. With all the strength he had left, he yanked Eve toward him, tearing the roots from her legs. She stumbled forward, gasping for air, but they didn't have much time. They couldn't afford to fight the forest any longer. Ryan didn't look back. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the light, the faint glimmer of hope growing brighter with every step. The forest screamed in frustration, its roots lashing at them, snapping like whips in the air. They were almost there. The light, now blindingly bright, stood like an oasis in the storm. As they ran toward it, the forest seemed to fight harder, the trees bending low, their branches reaching for them like fingers of some grotesque hand. But with every step, the light grew stronger, and Ryan felt something in his chest. The pulsing, rhythmic beat of the forest began to quiet. The forest's grip on them loosened, just enough. They broke through the last line of trees, stumbling into the open space where the light was strongest. It wasn't the sky, not at all. It wasn't the sun. It was a clearing, untouched by the darkness, where a single ancient tree stood. The bark was smooth, glowing with a soft, silver light, and around its roots was a ring of white flowers, untouched by decay or rot. The air here was crisp and clean, and the world felt alive in a way that was pure, untouched by the corruption that had overtaken the forest. But Ryan's heart skipped a beat as he looked up at the tree. It was no ordinary tree. It was massive, its roots sprawling beneath the ground, but it had a faint, glowing symbol etched into the trunk, an ancient sigil, half-formed, as if it had been waiting for something. Waiting for them. "This is it," Ryan whispered, his voice filled with awe. "This is the heart of the forest." Eve stepped forward cautiously, her eyes wide. The heart. But the keeper was supposed to be the heart, right? We broke it. Ryan nodded, his gaze fixed on a glowing symbol. "That's what we've been doing all along, fighting the keeper." But the keeper wasn't the source. The keeper was the guard, the protector. He reached out a trembling hand toward the tree. "This is the true power, and we've awakened it." Eve stared at the tree, her expression flickering between awe and fear. "But why does it want us dead? We freed it, didn't we?" Ryan shook his head. "No, we only broke the prison." He stepped closer to the tree, his breath coming quicker as he approached the glowing sigil on its bark. The symbol seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, a soft thrum in the air that resonated in his chest. "It's not the forest that's angry," Ryan said slowly, as the realization hit him. "It's the forest's defense. It's been bound for so long, forced into submission by the keeper. Now that it's free, it's like an animal being let out of its cage. It's confused, lost, and it doesn't know who to trust." "But we freed it," Eve repeated, her voice shaking. "We freed it. Why can't it see that?" Ryan swallowed, his throat dry. "Because we didn't ask for its permission. We didn't understand the cost of what we were doing. And now we have to face the consequences." There was a low rumble in the air, and the ground beneath them trembled once more, this time with a terrible, ominous force. The roots of the tree began to shift, glowing brighter, their tips reaching toward the clearing, almost as if the tree was waking fully, like it was preparing to consume them. Ryan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The light was no longer comforting. It was a warning. "Eve, I think we need to stop the tree from waking. If it does, the entire world could be consumed by it." The air was thick with tension, and for the first time, Ryan realized that they might have made a fatal mistake. They had awakened something ancient, something beyond their control. "I don't know if we can stop it now," Eve said quietly, her voice tinged with fear. Ryan didn't respond. His mind raced for answers, for anything that could save them. But in that moment, the tree's roots surged forward, reaching out like monstrous claws. They had woken the forest. Now it was coming for them. The tree's roots began to twist and writhe with a mind of their own, crawling toward them like enormous serpents, their bark covered in dark veins that pulsed with each movement. The air grew thick with a sense of impending doom, a heavy, suffocating presence that made Ryan's chest tighten with panic. "We have to stop it," Eve shouted, her voice filled with desperation. She grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him back as the massive roots crept closer, splitting the ground as they advanced. Ryan didn't know how much time they had left. His mind raced with every possible option, every possible way they could defeat the tree. But there was nothing. No weapon, no shield, no magic, nothing that could match the ancient force they had unleashed. The tree, the heart of the forest, was beyond their understanding. The roots surged forward with terrifying speed, and Ryan barely managed to dive out of the way, his body slamming into the ground as the tendrils snaked past him, narrowly missing. He scrambled to his feet, pulling Eve with him. "It's not going to stop," Eve cried, her breath ragged. "We need to find a way to shut it down. There has to be a way." Ryan's mind was racing. His eyes flickered back to the glowing symbol on the tree. There had to be something there, something that would explain this. The symbol on the tree's bark pulsed with unnatural energy, glowing brighter with every passing second. It was as if it was alive, calling to them. And in that moment, Ryan felt something, a pull deep within him. A strange connection, like the tree's power was reaching out to him, latching onto his very being. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a key. His hand trembled as he stepped closer to the tree, feeling an almost magnetic force drawing him to the glowing sigil. He hesitated, looking back at Eve, who was frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't understand what he was feeling. She couldn't feel what he felt. "I think I know what we have to do," Ryan said, his voice low and filled with a strange determination. "We need to use the sigil. It's the only way to stop this." Eve shook her head. "Ryan, you can't be serious. We don't even know what it means, what it does. If we touch it, if we try to interact with it, who knows what will happen? What if?" "I don't think we have a choice," Ryan interrupted, his voice steady despite the swirling panic inside him. He couldn't explain it, but deep down, he knew this was their only chance. The sigil was their connection to the forest. It had to be. The roots lurched toward them again, faster now, as if the tree could sense Ryan's decision. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. Ryan took a deep breath and reached out, pressing his hand to the glowing sigil on the tree's bark. The moment his fingers made contact, a shockwave of energy surged through his body, burning through his veins like wildfire. His entire body froze as an overwhelming sensation washed over him, a flood of images, of memories that weren't his own. He saw the forest in its purest form, untouched, vibrant, alive with life. He saw the keeper, not as a monster, but as a guardian, a protector who had kept the balance between the tree and the world. And then he saw the corruption, the slow decay of the land, the dark power that had begun to seep into the roots of the forest, poisoning it from within. It wasn't the keeper that had broken the forest, it was something else. Something ancient and dark, far older than the keeper itself. The heart of the forest. Ryan thought, barely able to comprehend the enormity of what he was experiencing. Suddenly, the image shattered, and Ryan was thrust back into reality, gasping for air, his body trembling. The power of the sigil was overwhelming, and his vision blurred, but he could feel the connection between him and the forest growing stronger. Eve was beside him, gripping his arm tightly. "Ryan, what did you see? What happened?" Ryan didn't answer right away. He was still reeling from the overwhelming visions that had flooded his mind. But in the depths of his thoughts, something clicked. He understood now. The sigil wasn't just a key, it was the heart. And if he could tap into it, truly understand it, he might be able to control the forest. Or at least, stop it. The ground beneath them shifted again, and the tree's roots began to surge forward. But this time, Ryan felt something different. The air hummed with energy, not the suffocating darkness that had surrounded them before, but a faint spark, a pulse of life, as if the forest was listening. "We need to focus," Ryan said, his voice barely a whisper. He stepped back from the tree, holding out his hands. "I have to feel the heart of the forest. I have to become a part of it." Eve stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Ryan, no, what if—" "I don't have time to explain," he said, his voice more firm now, more determined. "I've seen it. The forest isn't just alive. It's aware. It feels everything. But it's been corrupted. It's angry because it was forced to be something it wasn't. The keeper was a cage, and I broke it." Eve stepped back, her expression a mix of awe and fear. "You can't control it, Ryan. It's too powerful. Even if you understand it, even if you connect to it, what will it do to you?" Ryan didn't have an answer for that, but he couldn't turn back now. He had already felt the forest's pulse inside him. It was too late. The forest's power was in him now, and he had to stop it before it consumed everything. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, focusing on the energy flowing through him. He reached out, feeling the life of the forest, the pulse of the tree's power deep within the roots that spread beneath the earth. He felt the whispers of the trees, the longing of the land to be free again, to heal. It was like feeling a heartbeat, distant but real. The forest's pulse responded, a deep, guttural hum vibrating through him. Ryan concentrated harder, forcing his will into the rhythm of the heart, trying to steady the beat, to guide it. He couldn't control it completely, but he could guide it, direct it. And then he felt it. The tree's power shifted, the roots that had been lashing toward them slowing, halting in their advance. The angry vibrations in the air softened, and for a fleeting moment, the forest stilled. The dark energy that had been surging through the roots faded, replaced by something far gentler. Ryan opened his eyes slowly. He felt the connection, the balance, now restored like a fragile thread binding him to the forest. The tree's symbol flickered, glowing softly. But Ryan knew this wasn't over. The forest was still alive. And now it was waiting. Ryan stood there, his hands still hovering near the glowing sigil, the hum of energy surrounding him like a living, breathing force. He could feel the weight of the forest's ancient consciousness pressing down on him, like it was waiting for him to make the next move, the next decision. His heart raced. He had managed to calm the forest momentarily, but he knew that this fragile peace was only temporary. The dark energy that had infected the land was still there, lurking beneath the surface. And if the forest was to survive, if the balance was to be fully restored, it needed something else, something that he couldn't quite grasp yet. Eve, standing beside him, seemed to sense the same thing. Her eyes darted around the clearing, the air thick with the tension of something unfinished. "Ryan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What now? You've connected with it, but this isn't over." The Keeper was the one holding everything together. Without it, what happens to the world outside this forest? Ryan's mind raced. He had glimpsed the truth in his vision. The Keeper had been a necessary force to maintain the balance between the forest and the outside world. Without the Keeper, the boundary between the two realms was thinning, allowing the forest's ancient power to seep into the world. The rot that had been festering in the land would spread if they didn't act quickly. "I think the Keeper wasn't just a prison," Ryan said slowly, trying to put the pieces together. "It was also a barrier. It was holding the forest's power in check, preventing it from breaking free and consuming everything." Eve's eyes widened. "Are you saying?" "Yes," Ryan interrupted, his voice shaking with the weight of the revelation. The Keeper was the guardian, but it also kept the forest's true power contained. We've released it now, and if we don't stop it, everything outside these trees will be swallowed up. Eve's face went pale as the gravity of his words sank in. The realization that they had unknowingly torn down a vital part of the world's balance was almost too much to bear. "We had to put things back," Ryan continued, his voice growing more urgent. "The Keeper, its essence, it has to be returned to the heart of the forest. If we don't restore it, the forest's power will overtake everything. The boundary will be gone. The world will fall. But how do we do that?" Eve asked, her voice breaking with frustration. "How do we undo what's been done? We destroyed the Keeper. We saw it crumble." Ryan didn't have an immediate answer. His eyes drifted back to the sigil on the tree. There was something about it, some deeper knowledge buried within its ancient glow that whispered to him. But the path wasn't clear. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, with no map to guide him. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack in the air, followed by a low, rumbling growl from deep within the forest. Ryan's body stiffened, and Eve stepped back, her eyes scanning the shadows at the edge of the clearing. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, but this time it was different. The air shifted. Something was approaching. Ryan's heart hammered in his chest as the trees around them began to shift. The branches twisted, groaning and creaking as though something immense was pushing its way through the forest, making its presence known. A shadow moved across the clearing, blocking the faint light of the glowing sigil. A figure emerged from the darkness. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The Keeper. Not in its former, decayed form, but something else. The figure was tall and imposing, its body cloaked in shifting shadows that seemed to ripple like liquid. Its eyes glowed a deep, unnatural red, burning like twin lanterns in the dark. The sigil on its chest, once a symbol of corruption and death, now pulsed with a faint light, the essence of the forest still clinging to it. The Keeper was no longer a protector. It was something else, something changed. And in its eyes, Ryan saw something he had not seen before, understanding. "You." The Keeper's voice was low, rumbling like distant thunder, but there was a strange calmness to it now, as if the beast itself had shed its rage. "You have freed me, but at what cost?" Ryan couldn't move. He could feel the weight of the Keeper's gaze pressing down on him. The air crackled with a strange tension, and even the trees seemed to bow in acknowledgement of the Keeper's return. Eve's voice trembled as she stepped forward, her eyes locked on the creature. "What are you now? What do you want?" The Keeper's eyes shifted to her, its gaze unreadable, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged, full of unspoken understanding. Then, slowly, it spoke again, its voice echoing in their minds. "I was the forest protector, bound by forces older than you can comprehend. I was the cage, and now I am the key." Ryan's heart pounded as the Keeper's words sank in. It wasn't just the guardian of the forest anymore. It was the key to restoring balance. And with that, Ryan realized what had to be done. He had to return the Keeper's essence to the heart of the forest, but there was no simple way to do it. The Keeper was no longer a mere creature of power. It had become a vessel, a conduit, carrying the life of the forest within itself. The Keeper turned its head toward the tree, its body trembling with a strange energy. It stepped forward, its massive form eclipsing the clearing. "I cannot exist outside this realm," the Keeper said, its voice full of resignation. "The balance must be restored, and I must return to my place within the heart. But this time, I will not be bound." Ryan took a step forward, his pulse racing. "If you're the key, how do we fix this? How do we restore the balance?" The Keeper's gaze softened, as if it was seeing Ryan for the first time, truly seeing him. "You must face what you've awakened," it said. "The heart of the forest is not just a tree. It is a force, and you must decide whether to wield it or let it consume you." Ryan's mind spun with the enormity of the task ahead. If the Keeper was truly the key to restoring the balance, then there was a way to stop the forest from consuming the world. But to do so, he would have to embrace the heart of the forest, connect with it in ways that were beyond his understanding. It was no longer just a question of survival. It was a question of control. The Keeper stepped back, its form beginning to dissolve into the shadows, its eyes never leaving Ryan. "The path is yours to choose," it whispered. "But remember, once you accept the heart's power, it will never release you." Ryan stood still, his eyes locked on the Keeper as it began to fade into the shadows, its form dissolving into the dark mist that surrounded them. The weight of its words pressed down on him like an invisible force, suffocating him with the enormity of the decision before him. The Keeper had told him the truth. The heart of the forest wasn't just a powerful force. It was alive, and it was waiting for someone to take control of it, or let it consume everything in its path. Eve's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Ryan, we can't just accept this. If we do, if we embrace the forest's power, we have no idea what it will do to us. It could destroy everything." Ryan turned to her, feeling the weight of her words. He understood her fear, but there was something in him deep down that knew this was the only way. He could feel the pulse of the forest in his chest, like a second heartbeat, and he knew that the Keeper's warning wasn't just a threat, it was a truth. To control the heart, to restore balance, he had to be willing to pay a price. "I know," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "But what other choice do we have? We've already awakened it. The forest is breaking free, and if we don't act, it will destroy everything. I have to try." Eve hesitated, her brow furrowed in concern. "Ryan, please." But before she could finish, the ground shook again, more violently this time. The air grew thick with energy, swirling around them like a storm. Ryan turned back toward the tree, his gaze drawn to the sigil, which was now pulsing in time with the tremors beneath their feet. The tree's roots had stopped moving, but the forest was still restless, still angry. Ryan could feel it. The forest wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. It was fighting for dominion. Its power was trying to escape, to break free, and it didn't care who or what it destroyed in the process. He stepped forward, feeling the connection between himself and the forest growing stronger with each step. His heartbeat quickened as he approached the sigil again, his hand reaching out toward it. The energy in the air crackled, and for a moment, he felt a surge of fear of losing himself, of becoming a part of the forest forever. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the forest fall into chaos. Eve grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Ryan, you don't know what you're doing. Ryan looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. I have to do this, Eve. If I don't, we'll all be lost. With that, he pulled his arm free from her grasp and pressed his hand to the glowing sigil once more. The world around him seemed to collapse into itself as the energy surged through him. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the roots of the tree began to writhe again, this time with an almost desperate intensity. The pulse of the forest grew louder, faster, a deafening roar in his ears, drowning out everything else. Ryan's body went rigid as the energy from the tree flooded into him. It was more than just power. It was ancient, primal, a force that had existed for as long as the earth itself. The forest's heartbeat merged with his own, its rhythm syncing with his pulse as if they were one. In his mind's eye, he saw the entire forest spread out before him, a vast, endless sea of trees, each one connected by the roots beneath the earth. He could feel the life of every plant, every animal, every soil itself, all pulsing together in perfect harmony. And yet, he could also sense the destruction, the decay that was spreading through the roots, infecting the land. This was what the keeper had warned him about. The balance had been broken, and the forest was hungry. Hungry for more, hungry to reclaim what had been taken from it. Ryan's mind reeled as he struggled to control the power surging through him, feeling the weight of the forest's ancient consciousness pressing down on him, testing him. But then something shifted. He felt the essence of the keeper, its power, flowing through him, merging with the forest's energy. The keeper wasn't just a guardian, he realized. It was a protector, the balance between the forest and the world outside. And Ryan had to become that balance. A voice echoed in his mind, low and resonant, as if it came from the very earth itself. You have chosen. Ryan's breath hitched, his hand shaking as the sigil on the tree flared brightly, its light almost blinding. He could feel the forest's power surging within him, trying to overwhelm him, but he fought it back. He had to control it. He had to make it listen to him. The ground rumbled, and the tree's roots began to pull back, retreating from him, as if sensing the shift in the balance. The air seemed to clear, the suffocating weight of the forest's anger lifting just slightly. But Ryan knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. You will be its heart, the voice whispered, more clearly now. You will restore the balance, but you will not leave unchanged. Ryan's chest tightened. He knew the price. He had to become a part of the forest, a vessel for its power, for its will. He had to take on the role of the keeper, not as a protector, but as something more, something that could wield the power of the forest without losing himself to it. The trees around him bent toward him, the wind whispering with voices that were not of this world. He could feel the weight of the forest's memories, its ancient knowledge, flooding his mind. I can do this, Ryan whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure he believed it. I have to. Eve's voice broke through his thoughts. Ryan, don't do it. Please. We can still find another way. But Ryan didn't hear her. He couldn't. He had made his choice, and now there was no going back. His hand pressed harder against the sigil, and in that moment, the forest seemed to breathe with him. He felt the trees, the animals, the land itself, all pulling together with him, their power joining his in an unstoppable force. And then, the pulse of energy exploded through him, flooding his veins with pure, unfiltered power. The ground beneath his feet cracked, and the sky above seemed to split open with a blinding light. Ryan felt himself shatter as the forest's power engulfed him. His body, mind, and spirit merged with the ancient force that pulsed beneath the earth. The roots of the tree seemed to crawl into his veins, as though they were intertwining with his very essence. The ground beneath him buckled and cracked, and the very sky above seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the forest, beating in time with his own. Every tree, every living thing, every whisper of the wind felt like it was part of him, and yet there was something foreign, a dark energy that pulled at his soul. It clawed at the edges of his consciousness, threatening to devour him, to consume him. The keeper's voice echoed in his mind once more, not as a warning, but as a command. Embrace it. You are the heart of the forest now. You are its guardian. Ryan gasped for air, but the air seemed thinner now, as if the world itself was dissolving into the energy swirling around him. He could feel Eve's presence, faint but still anchored in the physical world, like a tether keeping him grounded. But that tether was fraying. He wanted to reach out to her, to call to her, but the power coursing through him was too overwhelming. His vision blurred as ancient memories, long forgotten, flooded his mind. He saw the world before the forest, when it was vibrant and untouched. He saw the keeper in its true form, majestic, regal, a creature of pure strength and wisdom. But he also saw the cracks in the land, the corruption that had slowly consumed the earth, until the keeper had become a mere shadow of what it once was. He saw the infection, the dark force that had begun to spread, poisoning everything it touched. And then he saw himself standing between two worlds. The forest, alive and pulsing, and the world outside, fading, dying. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the magnitude of his choice. He had not only freed the forest from the keeper's chains, he had also opened a gateway. The balance was now in his hands. But that power came at a price. The darkness, the rot, was still there, still festering beneath the earth, growing stronger, clawing at the edges of the forest's heart. And now, Ryan was the one who had to control it. Eve's voice broke through his thoughts, her words panicked and desperate. Ryan, please, you have to stop. You don't know what you're doing. Ryan could feel her desperation, but it was fading, slipping away like a distant echo. His vision flickered, and he realized that the connection he had formed with the forest was pulling him deeper into its embrace. You are the forest now, the voice within him whispered, growing louder, more insistent. You will become one with it. You will restore what was lost. But Ryan didn't want to lose himself. He wanted to hold on to his humanity, to the person he was before this, before the power, before the forest had taken him. Eve, he tried to say, but the words didn't come out. His throat felt tight, as if the energy in his body was choking him. The ground beneath him trembled again, and the roots of the tree seemed to surge forward, curling and twisting toward him, as if calling him home. He could feel the weight of the forest's presence growing stronger, the force of its will overpowering his own thoughts. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, like the sound of a branch breaking, and Ryan felt a surge of pain unlike anything he had ever felt before. His body jerked violently, and the air seemed to warp around him as the force of the forest's power surged through his very core. You cannot fight this. The voice of the forest whispered again, but this time there was something different in its tone, a coldness, a sense of inevitability. You have awakened the heart. You will become its keeper, or it will consume you. Ryan fought back the rising panic, struggling to maintain control. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. The forest was pulling him, dragging him deeper into its essence. He was becoming the forest, and in the process, he was losing himself. Ryan, Eve's voice was growing more distant, her words muffled as if coming from underwater. You have to stop. You have to fight it. Don't let it take you. But how could he fight it when the very essence of the forest had become a part of him? The dark power was consuming him, but it wasn't just the forest, it was something else. Something older, more primal. It was the rot, the corruption that had spread like a disease through the roots, infecting everything it touched. Ryan's mind felt like it was splitting in two. One part of him wanted to embrace the forest, to restore the balance, to accept the power that was now his. The other part, the human part, wanted to scream, to tear himself free of the suffocating grip of the ancient force that threatened to swallow him whole. The forest. The forest needs you, the voice in his mind urged. But Ryan could no longer tell if the voice was his own, or if it was something else, something that had taken him. He could feel the pulse of the heart of the forest, now a part of him. And as he reached for it, he felt something else within the depths of the roots. The darkness, the infection. It was still there, festering beneath the surface, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to succumb. I am the heart of the forest, Ryan whispered to himself, but the words felt hollow. The balance was his responsibility now. He could either destroy the darkness that threatened to consume the land, or he could be consumed by it. The roots surged forward, twisting around him like serpents, tightening their grip. He could feel the weight of the forest's power, its rage, its hunger. And in that moment, he realized something terrible. The forest's power wasn't just alive. It was aware. It had a will of its own. And it wasn't interested in balance. It wanted to consume. The corruption, the rot, it wasn't just an external force. It was the forest itself. It had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Ryan was caught between two worlds now. The world of humanity that he had once known, and the dark, twisted realm of the forest that was claiming him, piece by piece. Ryan, Eve's voice shattered his thoughts, urgent and full of terror. You have to fight it. You can't let it take you. But as Ryan felt the power of the forest surge through him, he knew he was running out of time. The darkness was closing in, and soon there would be no turning back. Ryan stood at the center of the forest, his body trembling with the raw power coursing through him. The roots of the ancient tree had wrapped around his limbs, binding him to the earth, while the pulse of the forest's heart echoed through his veins. It was alive in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. The sheer force of it made his thoughts feel distant, as though he were slowly fading into the forest's embrace. Yet, even as the forest's power consumed him, something inside him fought. He wasn't entirely gone, not yet. The darkness, the rot, was still there, crawling beneath the surface of the earth. It wasn't just a poison, it was part of the forest. The balance that the keeper had once maintained was shattered. And now, Ryan had to make the hardest choice of all. Ryan, Eve's voice, full of panic, reached him, but it seemed muffled, as though she were calling from a great distance. He struggled to keep his mind clear, to hold on to what remained of his humanity, but it was becoming harder with each passing moment. The forest wanted him, wanted all of him, but at what cost? He could feel the darkness pushing against his mind, the rot calling out to him, urging him to embrace it. The keeper's voice echoed in his thoughts again, as if it were inside him now, part of the same consciousness. You have the power to restore the balance. You have the power to save the world, or to let it fall. Ryan's chest tightened, and he could feel his body weakening as the power of the forest began to settle into him, twisting his very essence. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. Suddenly, Eve was there, her hand reaching out to him, her eyes wide with terror. "Ryan, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't let it take you. I need you." Those words, "I need you," brought a flicker of humanity back to him. He looked into her eyes, seeing the person he was, the life he once knew, reflected in her gaze. He couldn't let this power destroy him. He couldn't let it destroy her or the world. Eve's voice was the only tether left to his past, to who he had been before this storm of power and darkness. He wasn't just the forest. He was Ryan. And he needed to fight to make the choice. With a deep, painful breath, Ryan forced himself to focus. The forest's heartbeat pounded in his ears, its presence like a vice around his chest. But he fought it. He had to. I am not the forest, Ryan thought fiercely, pushing against the weight of the power that threatened to overwhelm him. I am me. The roots around him twisted tighter, the dark energy pulling at his soul, but he fought. He focused on Eve, on the life outside this place, and on the choice that still remained. Ryan closed his eyes, and with every ounce of strength he had left, he reached for the core of the forest's heart, the source of its power, the darkness that had begun to consume everything. He felt its grip tighten around him, like a serpent sinking its fangs into his skin, but he didn't give in. He couldn't. He reached into the darkness with his mind, with his soul, and he seized it. It wasn't just a matter of controlling it. It was about understanding it, confronting it. The rot was not just a disease. It was the forest's fear, its sorrow, its anger at being forgotten, at being abandoned. For a brief, terrible moment, Ryan thought he would drown in it. The darkness rushed over him like a wave, trying to drown his spirit, to break him apart. But he didn't let it. He embraced it not as an enemy, but as a part of the forest itself. With a forceful cry, he willed the darkness into submission, pushing it back into the roots, deep beneath the surface of the earth. The forest shuddered as the power that had been festering in its heart was forced back. Ryan's body burned with the effort, his limbs shaking violently. He could feel the pull of the forest growing weaker, the roots loosening their grip on him. The darkness was no longer consuming him. It was retreating, contained, bound once more by his will. The forest, too, seemed to sigh in relief, the energy around him quieting, the frantic pulse slowing to a calm, rhythmic beat. The power was still there, but it was no longer out of control. The balance had been restored. Eve rushed to his side, her hand gripping his tightly as he collapsed to the ground, the last of the energy leaving his body. His mind felt distant, like he had just woken from a long, exhausting dream. Ryan, Eve whispered, tears streaking down her face as she cradled his head in her lap. Are you okay? Ryan could barely manage a smile, his voice hoarse. I think we made it. He looked around at the clearing, the once writhing roots now still, the air calm. The darkness had been pushed back, but he knew it wasn't gone forever. It would always be there, deep within the earth. But for now, the balance was restored. Eve's hand tightened around his. You did it. You saved us. Ryan closed his eyes, letting out a deep breath. The pain in his body was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the weight that had lifted from his heart. He had chosen to fight the darkness, to save the world, not by embracing the power, but by confronting it. The forest would remain, as it always had, but now it was at peace. The boundary between the two worlds had been restored, at least for now, and Ryan, though forever changed, had kept his humanity. As the sun began to set over the horizon, the first rays of light filtering through the trees, Ryan knew that the battle had been won, but the war would never truly be over. The forest was still. Ryan and Eve stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the land. The trees were no longer twisting, no longer alive with the dark energy that had once threatened to consume everything. The world outside the forest had begun to heal, and though it would take time, Ryan knew that the balance would hold for now. Do you think it will stay this way? Eve asked quietly, her voice full of uncertainty. Ryan looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. I don't know, but we'll be ready if it changes again. The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth, of new life. The forest was no longer a place of fear, but a place of growth. And though the darkness still lingered deep within the roots, it was no longer the force that defined the forest. It was Ryan's choice that had saved them all. And though he would carry the weight of it for the rest of his life, he had made peace with the cost. The forest had its heart again, and with that, Ryan finally felt at peace.